in the heart of ancient forests, where towering pines whispered secrets older than memory and maple leaves danced in eternal conversation with the wind. There lived a people who understood that trees were teachers and streams were storytellers. Here, beneath canopies so thick they filtered sunlight into cathedral gold, the earth itself breathed with the rhythm of seasons unchanged since the world was young. The forest was not merely home, it was grandmother, protector, and sacred council, chamber where spirits walked alongside the living. In clearings, scattered like emeralds through this green kingdom, smoke rose from longhouses built of bark and dreams, carrying prayers skyward on wings of cedar smoke. This was a realm where governance flowed like rivers, where peace was planted like corn, and where the greatest leaders were those who listened to the counsel of trees and the wisdom of grandmothers 7 generations deep. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here, by the way. Where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one, long before the great Confederacy that would echo through centuries. The woodlands of what would become known as the Northeastern Territories held within their embrace 5 distinct peoples, each as rooted in the earth as the ancient oaks that watched over their villages. The Mohawk, the keepers of the eastern door, dwelt where dawn first touched the forest floor. The Oneida, the people of the standing stone, made their homes among hills that rose like sleeping giants. The Onondaga, the keepers of the fire, lived at the heart of the woodland realm, where sacred flames would one day burn eternal. The Cayuga, the people of the great swamp, knew the secret places where water and earth whispered ancient agreements. And the Seneca, the keepers of the western door, stood guard where sunset painted the sky in colors that matched the autumn maples. Each nation moved through the seasons with the practiced grace of those who had learned the forest's rhythms across countless generations. In spring, when the maple sap ran sweet and the earth softened beneath awakening roots, they emerged from winter lodges like butterflies from cocoons, ready to plant the 3 sisters' corn, beans, and squash in clearings where their ancestors had planted before them. The women, keepers of the seeds and guardians of the growing seasons, understood that the earth was not conquered but courted, not owned but honored. Summer brought the season of gathering, when the forest offered its gifts with open hands. Wild strawberries carpeted hidden meadows in rubies that burst with sweetness on the tongue. Blackberries hung heavy on thorned vines, teaching patience to those who would harvest their treasure. Nuts fell like prayers answered, while medicinal plants revealed themselves to those who knew how to see with their grandmother's eyes. The men moved through this abundance like shadows, given substance, hunting not with the hunger of conquerors, but with the reverence of those who understood they were part of a great circle that included predator and prey, taker and given. When autumn arrived, painting the world in flames that burned without consuming, the people gathered the harvest that would carry them through winter's testing. Corn was dried and stored in bark containers. Beans were threaded into long necklaces that would feed families through the hungry months, and squash was preserved in ways that kept summer's warmth alive, even when snow lay deep upon the ground. This was the season of Thanksgiving, when the people lifted their voices in songs that had been sung since the first harvest, acknowledging the generosity of a world that asked only for respect in return. Winter wrapped the forest kingdom in silence. That was not empty, but full of stories told around fires that pushed back the darkness, full of the quiet work of women weaving baskets from ash splints, while children learned the old tales that kept the people's memory alive. In longhouses that stretched like sleeping giants across the snow-covered clearings, extended families lived in harmony that was both practical and sacred. The grandmothers, those wise women who had earned their place as counselors through decades of careful observation, guided the younger women in arts that were both craft and ceremony. These were not primitive people scraping existence from an unforgiving wilderness, but sophisticated societies that had learned to live as part of the forest's own design. Their governance was complex, their agriculture advanced, their understanding of ecology profound. They knew which plants healed and which harmed, which combinations of crops enriched the soil and which depleted it, which hunting practices maintained the balance that kept all creatures fed. The longhouses themselves were marvels of engineering and social organization. Built from the flexible strength of young trees and the weather wisdom of bark, they stretched sometimes for hundreds of feet, housing dozens of families in compartments that provided privacy while maintaining the social bonds that kept communities strong. The central corridor served as highway and gathering place, where children played games that taught them the skills they would need as adults, where young people listened to elders whose memories reached back to times when the world was different. Yet, for all their sophistication, for all their harmony with the natural world, these 5 nations knew the bitter taste of warfare. Blood had been spilled beneath the peaceful trees. Smoke of burning villages had darkened skies that should have held only clouds. And mothers had keened for sons who would never return from raids that solved nothing and settled nothing. The cycle of revenge spun like a terrible wheel, each act of violence demanding another, each loss requiring compensation that only bred more loss. Children grew up knowing that strangers might mean death, that the forest paths which should have been arteries of trade and friendship had become highways of fear. Warriors painted their faces, not for ceremony, but for battle, and weapons were crafted, not for hunting, but for human prey. The seasonal round continued planting and harvesting, gathering and preserving, but always under the shadow of potential violence, always with one eye watching the tree line for enemies who might emerge without warning. This was the world into which the Peacemaker would eventually come. A world beautiful and terrible, sophisticated and brutal, where people who had learned to live in harmony with the earth still struggled to live in harmony with each other. The Forest Kingdom held all the elements of paradise, but paradise marred by the ancient human failing of turning neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. In those days before the Great Peace, darkness seemed to settle over the woodland realm like smoke from countless burning villages. The cycle of violence had grown so entrenched that many could no longer remember what had started the feuds that now consumed entire generations. Young men reached for weapons before they reached for tools, and mothers sang lullabies that were also prayers for their children's survival. The Mohawk raids struck like summer lightning, sudden, devastating, and leaving destruction in their wake. Villagers would wake to find their palisades breached, their stores burned, their kinfolk taken or killed. The surviving elders would gather in the ashes of their homes, their faces masks of grief and rage, planning retribution that would bring the same sorrow to their enemies' hearths. Thus the wheel turned, each spoke another tragedy, each revolution grinding hope a little finer. Among the Onondaga, there lived a woman whose name has been lost to time, but whose influence would reshape the world. She was known simply as the Mother of Nations, though she had watched her own sons fall to the very violence she would help end. Her hair had gone white, not with years alone, but with the weight of witnessing too much death, too much senseless destruction of the very people who should have been allies against the true dangers that threatened all. This woman, wise beyond her seasons and patient beyond human understanding, began to dream of peace. Not the peace of exhaustion that comes when warriors grow too old to fight, nor the peace of defeat that bows one nation to another, but a peace built on strength shared rather than strength hoarded. She dreamed of governance that flowed like water, finding its way around obstacles rather than smashing through them. She dreamed of councils where enemies sat as brothers, where decisions were made not by the strongest voice, but by the wisest consensus. Her dreams were not idle fantasies, but visions that came to her in the quiet hours before dawn, when the forest held its breath and the veil between worlds grew thin. She saw a great tree with roots spreading deep into the earth and branches reaching toward the sky, providing shelter for all who would rest beneath its shade. She saw 5 arrows that could be broken one by one, but bound together became unbreakable. She saw fires that burned in perpetuity, not consuming but illuminating, not destroying but preserving the sacred obligations that would bind nation to nation, nation to nation. But dreams alone could not stop the killing. Dreams alone could not heal the wounds that generations of warfare had carved into the hearts of the people. For the vision to become reality, it would need a messenger, someone who could walk between the warring nations, carrying words of peace to ears grown deaf from the sound of war cries. It would need someone who could speak the language of warriors while carrying the message of peace. Someone whose very presence would command attention and respect even from those whose hearts were hardened by loss and anger. The forests themselves seemed to mourn the violence that stained their floors with blood that should have nourished life. Ancient trees that had witnessed the first coming of the people to these lands now watched their descendants turn the gifts of earth and sky into instruments of destruction. The spirits that dwelt in the sacred places grew restless, sending signs that went unheeded by people too consumed with their immediate grievances to pay attention to the larger patterns that governed all life. Winter that year seemed longer than usual, as if the earth itself had grown weary of the bloodshed and retreated into deeper sleep. The snow lay heavy on the Longhouse roofs, muffling sound and isolating communities that had once traded freely along forest paths, now grown dangerous. Families huddled around fires that seemed to give less warmth, eating preserved foods that tasted of ashes and despair. Even the children's games reflected the violence that surrounded them, their play acting out raids and battles, their laughter taking on the sharp edge of weapons being sharpened. Yet, in that darkest season, when hope seemed as distant as the hidden sun, something stirred in the depths of the forest. Hunters returning from their trap lines spoke of strange signs, deer gathering in unnaturally large herds, as if seeking protection in numbers, eagles circling in patterns that resembled the peace symbols carved on ancient trees, streams that flowed unusually clear despite the winter's debris. The eldest shamans, those who could still read the language of spirits and seasons, began to whisper that change was coming, that the earth itself was preparing for transformation. Among the Huron, traditional enemies of the 5 nations, there lived a man whose birth had been marked by portents that even his enemies acknowledged. Born during an eclipse that painted the moon the color of blood, he had emerged into a world that seemed to hold its breath. His mother, laboring through that strange night when darkness conquered light only to release it again, spoke of visions that came to her in the midst of her pain, visions of a great white canoe that would carry peace across the waters of war, of a messenger who would speak with the voice of the Creator himself. This child grew into manhood, carrying those visions like seeds in fertile earth, while other young men learned the arts of war. He studied the older arts, the ceremonies that connected earth to sky, the languages that allowed communication between peoples, the deep patience required to transform hearts rather than simply conquering them. He learned to speak not only with his own people, but with the languages of their enemies. Not to spy or deceive, but to understand the common roots that fed all human hearts. The seasons turned and turned again, each cycle of growth and harvest. Hunting and gathering, bringing the woodland realm closer to the moment when transformation would begin. The Mother of Nations continued her dreaming, the visions growing clearer and more urgent with each passing moon. The violence continued too, but now it carried within it the seeds of its own ending. Like a fire that burns so hot, it eventually consumes all fuel and dies into coals that can warm without destroying. And in the forest depths, where the oldest trees kept the oldest secrets, something waited patient as stones, enduring as water, inevitable as the return of spring. The great transformation was coming, though none yet knew the face it would wear or the voice with which it would speak. The forest kingdom prepared for peace as it had once prepared for war, gathering its strength not for destruction but for the far more difficult task of creation. The morning when everything changed began like any other morning in that season of sorrows. Mist rose from the lake waters like the breath of sleeping spirits, and the forest awakened to the familiar sounds of a world that had grown accustomed to the nearness of violence. Women emerged from longhouses to tend fires that had burned through the night, their movements careful and watchful, always listening for sounds that might herald danger. Children played quietly, their games subdued by the knowledge that loud voices might carry too far, might reach ears that wished them harm. But this morning carried something different in its air, a quality of attention that made even the birds seem to listen more carefully to their own songs. The hunters who had gone out before dawn returned earlier than expected, their faces marked not with the satisfaction of successful tracking, but with wonder that rendered them temporarily speechless. They spoke haltingly of a figure they had encountered in the deep woods, a man who seemed to walk without disturbing the forest floor, whose presence had caused the very trees to lean inward as if straining to hear his words. The Peacemaker. This was the name by which he would be known to history. Though he bore others given by birth and ceremony, had begun the journey that would transform the woodland realm. He moved through the forest with the fluid grace of one who belonged completely to the natural world, yet carried about him an aura of purpose that set him apart from any wanderer or refugee fleeing the violence that plagued the land. His appearance was both ordinary and extraordinary. Dressed in the simple garments of a traveling man, he carried no weapons save a bag of white shells and words that would prove sharper than any blade forged by human hands. His face bore the marks of one who had seen much sorrow but had not been broken by it, eyes that reflected the depth of forest pools and held within them a light that came from sources beyond the physical sun. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of one who spoke not merely his own thoughts, but truths that flowed from the very source of life itself. He spoke of the Creator's intention for the people, of a design that included all nations but required their cooperation to fully manifest. He spoke of peace not as the absence of war, but as the presence of justice, not as weakness masquerading as strength, but as strength so complete it needed no proof through violence. His first contact came among the Mohawk, those fierce guardians of the eastern territories whose reputation for warfare had spread far beyond their forest homeland. The warriors who encountered him expected to face either a fool who did not understand the dangers of traveling alone through hostile territory, or a spy whose smooth words concealed darker purposes. What they found instead was a man who spoke their language perfectly, who knew their customs as if he had been raised among them, yet who carried news of a different way of being that challenged everything they thought they knew about strength and survival. The Peacemaker did not condemn the warfare that had consumed the people for generations. Instead, he acknowledged the pain that had driven them to take up arms, the genuine grievances that had fueled the cycle of violence. He spoke of the mothers who had lost sons, the children who had grown up without fathers, the communities that had been scattered like seeds on the wind. But then he spoke of another way that would honor the legitimate needs, that warfare tried to serve while achieving those goals through methods that built rather than destroyed. His message was not simple, for the problems it addressed were not simple. The peace he proposed would require structures of governance more complex and sophisticated than anything the separate nations had attempted. It would require new ceremonies to mark the new relationships between peoples who had known each other only as enemies. It would require new ways of thinking about justice, about responsibility, about the obligations that bound individuals to their communities and communities to the larger web of life. Among the Mohawk, he found his first convert in a woman whose own losses had nearly broken her spirit. Jigan say she was called the Mother of Nations, the same woman whose dreams had prepared the way for the message the Peacemaker now carried in word and deed. When she heard him speak of the great tree of peace that would shelter all nations, she recognized the vision that had come to her in the dark hours before dawn, when he spoke of the councils that would replace warfare with deliberation. She heard the echo of voices that had whispered to her in dreams. Their meeting was like the joining of two streams that had long flowed toward the same destination. She had prepared the soil, he carried the seeds. She had dreamed the vision, he brought the practical knowledge needed to make dreams into living reality. Together, they began the work of transformation that would require not months, but years, not the conversion of individuals, but the reshaping of entire societies. The process was neither swift nor easy. For every person who heard the message of peace and felt their heart leap with recognition, there were others whose pain had hardened into permanent suspicion, whose losses had carved such deep wounds that healing seemed impossible. The war chiefs, whose authority depended on the continuation of conflict, listened with skepticism that sometimes flared into open hostility. The warriors, trained from childhood to measure themselves by their prowess in battle, struggled to imagine a world where their skills might be turned to different purposes, yet slowly, like the patient work of water wearing new channels through stone, the message began to spread. In longhouses where grandmothers gathered to share the evening meal, conversations turned to the stranger who spoke of peace. Around fires where men crafted weapons, hands began to hesitate, hearts began to question whether there might be another way to protect what they loved. Children who had grown up expecting to inherit a world of violence began to dream of something different, something that their elders had told them was impossible, but which now seemed to shimmer just beyond the horizon of possibility. The Peacemaker did not travel alone in this work. He was joined by others who had heard the message and felt its truth resonate in their own hearts. Chief among these was a man whose very name had become synonymous with violence, whose reputation for warfare had spread terror across the woodland realm. Hiawatha, called by some the Hiawatha, had been a war chief whose grief over the loss of his own family had transformed him into an instrument of revenge so complete that even his enemies spoke his name in whispers. The transformation of such a man from warrior to peacemaker would become one of the great stories of the new Confederacy. His journey from darkness to light, from revenge to reconciliation, would serve as proof that no heart was so hardened that it could not be opened, no pattern of violence so entrenched that it could not be transformed. When Hiawatha laid down his weapons and took up the wampum belts that would become the constitutional documents of the new Confederation, he carried with him the moral authority of one who had seen the futility of warfare from the inside and chosen a different path together. The Peacemaker, the mother of nations, and the reformed war chief began the delicate work of building bridges between peoples who had known each other only as enemies. They traveled from village to village, from nation to nation, carrying the message of the great law that would govern the new Confederacy. They spoke in council houses where decisions had always been made by individual nations, proposing instead a system where the wisdom of all would be pooled for the benefit of all. The resistance they encountered was fierce and often personal. Old wounds do not heal simply because new medicine is offered. Ancient grievances do not dissolve because better alternatives are proposed. Progress came slowly, measured not in great victories but in small conversations, not in dramatic conversions but in gradual shifts of heart and mind that accumulated like snowflakes into an avalanche of change. As the seasons cycled through there, eternal round planting and harvesting, hunting and gathering, the ceremonies that marked the people's continuing relationship with the living world, the message of peace began to take root. Like seeds scattered by wind and carried by water, it found fertile ground in hearts that had grown weary of war, in minds that could envision better ways of resolving the conflicts that would always arise between peoples who shared the same land and competed for the same resources. The forest itself seemed to respond to the changing atmosphere. Hunters reported that game was more abundant, as if the animals themselves sensed a shift toward harmony. The crops that year grew with unusual vigor, as if the earth itself was preparing to nourish a larger community. Even the weather seemed to cooperate, providing the right balance of sun and rain needed for both the practical work of survival and the ceremonial work of transformation. Yet the greatest changes were not in the external world, but in the hearts and minds of the people themselves. In longhouses where weapons had once hung ready for instant use, those same weapons began to be stored away, kept for hunting rather than warfare. In councils where decisions had once been made quickly to respond to immediate threats, deliberation became more careful, more thoughtful, as leaders began to consider not just immediate consequences, but effects that might ripple through 7 generations of descendants yet unborn. The transformation was far from complete, and challenges lay ahead that would test the new Confederation in ways its founders could not yet imagine. But the foundation had been laid, the vision had been shared, and the great work of building peace from the ashes of war had begun. The Forest Kingdom was preparing to become something new, something that would endure long after the trees that sheltered its birth had returned to the earth that nurtured them all. The clans began to understand that their survival depended not on conquest, but on cooperation. The white pine, tallest of all trees in their forest realm, became the symbol of this new understanding, its roots spreading deep and wide, its branches reaching toward the same sky that sheltered them all. From across the great waters came one, whose very presence seemed to calm the storms of human hearts. The Peacemaker arrived, not with armies or thunder, but with words that fell like gentle rain on parched earth. His canoe, carved from white stone according to the ancient songs, moved across Lake Ontario as if the waters themselves recognized his sacred purpose. The mists parted before him, and even the morning birds grew silent, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold in the world of men. The peacemaker's face bore the serenity of one who had gazed into the heart of creation and found it good. His voice, when he spoke, carried the rhythm of flowing streams and the strength of deep-rooted oaks. He came to the Haudenosaunee not as a conqueror seeking dominion, but as a gardener who sees potential in wild ground and knows how to nurture it into something beautiful. The first to encounter him were the Mohawk people, the keepers of the eastern door, whose warriors had grown weary of endless battles that brought neither glory nor peace. When the peacemaker stepped onto their shores, the very quality of light seemed to change. Children who had known only the sound of war cries heard, for the first time, the possibility of laughter without fear. Mothers who had sent sons to battle and waited through sleepless nights began to dream of mornings when war paint would be replaced by the gentle colors of celebration. The peacemaker spoke to them of the great tree of peace, a vision so profound that even the most hardened warriors found their hearts stirring with unfamiliar hope. He described a mighty white pine that would grow at the center of their world, its branches sheltering all nations, its roots extending in 4 directions to carry the white roots of peace to every corner of the earth. Beneath this tree, he promised, weapons would be buried so deep that their clash would never again disturb the sleep of children. But visions alone do not transform the world. The peacemaker understood that peace required more than beautiful words that needed structure, law, and the wisdom to govern human nature itself. As he traveled from village to village, his message evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple calls for an end to warfare. He began to speak of government, of balance, of systems that could channel human ambition into paths that served the common good. The Onondaga nation, dwelling at the geographical heart of what would become the Great Confederacy, presented the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity. Their chief, Tadodaho, was a man whose very name conjured images of serpents and shadows. His hair was said to writhe with living snakes, his body twisted by the poisons of hatred and revenge. Yet the peacemaker saw beyond the surface corruption to the fierce intelligence beneath, recognizing that such powerful darkness, once transformed, could become the most radiant light. For days and nights, the peacemaker sat with Tadodaho there, conversations weaving through the philosophical foundations of human society. They spoke of power and its proper use, of the difference between ruling and leading, of the sacred responsibility that comes with governing the lives of others. Gradually, as understanding dawned in Tadodaho's mind, the serpents in his hair began to still, the twisting of his body began to straighten, and the light of wisdom began to shine where once only cunning had resided. The transformation of Tadodaho became a legend that would echo through generations, not merely because of its dramatic symbolism, but because it demonstrated the peacemaker's most profound insight, that true peace begins with the healing of individual hearts and minds. No system of government, however wisely designed, could succeed if the people within it remained prisoners of their own fear, anger, and mistrust. As the peacemaker's influence spread, he began to attract followers who would help him translate vision into reality. Among these was Hiawatha, a man of the Onondaga whose own heart had been broken by tragedy and loss. Hiawatha had lost his daughters to the violence that plagued their world, and grief had driven him into the wilderness, where he lived alone with his sorrow and rage. The peacemaker found him there, not as a teacher instructing a student, but as one wounded healer recognizing another. Together, they developed the ritual of Condolence, a ceremony that would become central to Haudenosaunee culture. They understood that grief unexpressed becomes poison, that loss unacknowledged becomes the seed of future violence. The condolence ceremony created a sacred space where tears could flow safely, where the community could surround the grieving with support, where the dead could be honored without the living being enslaved to their memory. Hiawatha's role in the great work was crucial, for he possessed skills the Peacemaker alone could not provide. While the Peacemaker was the visionary, Hiawatha was the diplomat, the one who could speak the language of practical politics. He understood how to negotiate between competing interests, how to find common ground among people who seemed to share nothing but mutual suspicion. His shell beads, woven into intricate patterns, became the first wampum belts, physical records of agreements that would bind nations together across generations. The creation of the great law of peace was not the work of a single moment or even a single season. It emerged gradually, like a forest growing from scattered seeds. As the Peacemaker and his companions traveled from nation to nation, listening, learning, adapting their vision to the realities they encountered, each people brought their own traditions, their own understanding of justice and governance, their own gifts to the emerging whole. The Mohawk contributed their role as guardians and protectors, understanding that peace must sometimes be defended by those willing to stand firm against aggression. The Oneida brought their expertise in council procedures, their knowledge of how to facilitate discussion and reach consensus among strong-willed individuals. The Onondaga offered their central location and their tradition of mediation, becoming the keepers of the central fire around which all other nations would gather. The Cayuga, known for their eloquence and their ability to remember vast amounts of oral tradition, became the keepers of the great law itself, responsible for ensuring that its provisions would be passed down unchanged through the generations. The Seneca, guardians of the Western Door, brought their knowledge of diplomacy with distant peoples, their understanding of how to maintain relationships across vast distances and cultural differences. As the great law took shape, it revealed itself to be unlike any system of government the world had yet seen. It was not based on the divine right of kings or the accumulation of power in the hands of a few. Instead, it distributed authority across multiple levels and multiple groups, creating a web of checks and balances that would prevent any individual or faction from dominating the others. The great law of peace stood like a magnificent longhouse, its framework built not of wood and bark, but of principles that could bend without breaking, could shelter many different peoples under one roof while allowing each to maintain their distinct identity. The genius of this system lay not in its complexity, but in its recognition of the fundamental truth that sustainable governance must flow from the will of the people it serves. At the foundation of the great law was the recognition that women were the ultimate source of life and therefore the ultimate source of political authority. The clan mothers, elder women chosen for their wisdom and their dedication to the welfare of their people, held the power to select and to remove the chiefs who would speak for their clans in the great councils. This was not merely a symbolic gesture toward gender equality, but a practical recognition that those who bear and nurture life have the deepest investment in ensuring that society protects and supports that life. The clan mothers watched over their chiefs like gardeners tending growing things. They observed not only their public actions, but their private character, understanding that power has a way of revealing hidden flaws that can poison entire communities. A chief who grew arrogant, who forgot that he served rather than ruled, who began to put his own interests above those of his people, would find himself gently but firmly reminded of his responsibilities. If reminders proved insufficient, he would find his authority removed as quietly as it had been granted. the chiefs themselves were bound by obligations that transformed leadership from a privilege into a burden willingly carried for the good of all. They were required to consider the impact of every decision not just on their own generation, but on 7 generations yet to come. This principle of 7-generation thinking permeated every aspect of Haudenosaunee governance, creating a culture of long-term stewardship that treated the earth itself as a sacred trust. When the Grand Council met, it followed procedures that ensured every voice would be heard, every perspective considered. The Mohawk and Seneca, as the older brothers, would speak first on any matter brought before the council. Their words would be carried across the fire to the Oneida and Cayuga, the younger brothers, who would discuss the matter among themselves before responding. Only when both sides had reached their conclusions would the matter be presented to the Onondaga, who served as the firekeepers and the ultimate arbiters of council business. This system prevented hasty decisions while ensuring that all viewpoints were thoroughly explored. It recognized that wisdom often emerges not from the brilliance of individuals, but from the patient work of collective deliberation. Arguments were heard not as battles to be won, but as contributions to a shared search for truth. The goal was not to defeat opponents, but to find solutions that all could support. The Great Law also established clear procedures for resolving disputes between individuals, clans, and even nations within the Confederacy. Rather than relying on punishment and retribution, these procedures emphasized restoration and healing. When someone committed a crime, the focus was not on making them suffer, but on repairing the damage they had caused and ensuring they could be reintegrated into the community as productive, trustworthy members. This restorative approach extended to matters of war and peace with nations outside the Confederacy. The Great Law established clear protocols for how conflicts should be addressed, beginning always with attempts at negotiation and diplomatic resolution. War was seen not as glorious adventure, but as a last resort when all other means of resolving disputes had been exhausted. Even then, warfare was governed by strict rules designed to minimize unnecessary suffering and to create possibilities for future peace. The white roots of peace, symbolic extensions of the great tree, were sent out in all directions to invite other nations to shelter beneath the tree's protective branches. These were not conquests, but invitations to join a growing community of peoples, committed to resolving their differences through reason rather than violence. Nations that accepted these invitations were not absorbed or dominated, but welcomed as equals, free to maintain their own customs and traditions while participating in the larger Confederacy's shared governance. The spiritual dimensions of the Great Law were as carefully considered as its political structures. The Peacemaker understood that human societies reflect the spiritual condition of their members, that lasting peace required not just good laws, but transformed hearts. The Great Law therefore incorporated ceremonies and rituals designed to remind people constantly of their connections to each other, to the natural world, and to the Creator who was the ultimate source of all peace. The Thanksgiving address, spoken at the beginning of every gathering, created a shared moment of gratitude that reminded all present of their dependence on forces beyond their control. They gave thanks to the earth that supported them, to the waters that sustained life, to the plants and animals that fed them, to the wind that brought change, to the sun and moon that marked the passage of time, to the Creator who had made all things possible. This practice cultivated humility, recognizing that human power was limited, and that the greatest wisdom lay in working with natural forces rather than against them. The seasonal ceremonies marked the rhythm of agricultural and spiritual life, creating regular opportunities for communities to come together in celebration and renewal. The midwinter ceremony acknowledged the year's death and rebirth. The maple ceremony celebrated the first sweet sap of spring. The planting ceremony blessed the seeds that would become the people's food. The green corn ceremony gave thanks for the summer's growth. And the harvest ceremony expressed gratitude for the earth's generosity. These ceremonies were not merely religious observances, but vital elements of social cohesion. They brought people together across clan and village lines, reinforcing the bonds that held the Confederacy together. They provided opportunities for young people to learn traditional knowledge, for elders to pass on their wisdom, for families to strengthen their ties, for communities to address problems before they became crises. The three sisters corn, beans, and squash became powerful symbols of how different elements could work together for mutual benefit. Corn provided a structure for beans to climb. Beans fixed nitrogen in the soil to feed the corn and squash. Squash spread across the ground to retain moisture and discourage weeds. Together, they produced more food than any of them could have grown alone. Just as the 5 nations of the Confederacy could accomplish together what none could achieve in isolation. Unlike the written laws of distant empires, carved in stone and enforced by sword, the great law of peace lived in the hearts and minds of the people, passed down through generations, not as rigid commandments, but as living wisdom that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential spirit. This oral tradition was not a weakness, but a strength, for it required each generation to actively engage with the law, to understand it deeply enough to teach it to their children, to wrestle with its principles until they became second nature. The recitation of the great law was itself a ceremony, a sacred performance that could take days to complete in its entirety. The law-keepers, chosen for their exceptional memories and their deep understanding of legal principles, would speak the ancient words while the community listened, occasionally joining in the responses that punctuated the recitation. These were not merely legal proceedings, but spiritual experiences that reinforced the bonds between the people and their covenant with each other and with the Creator. The wampum belts served as both memory aids and legal documents, their intricate patterns encoding the details of specific agreements and the broad principles that governed Haudenosaunee society. Each belt told a story, and the keeper of the belt was responsible for knowing not just the story itself, but all the circumstances surrounding its creation. The negotiations that had led to the agreement it represented, the ongoing obligations it created, the 2-row wampum, perhaps the most famous of these belts, depicted 2 parallel lines of purple beads running through a field of white. This simple design encoded a profound philosophy of coexistence, representing the agreement between the Haudenosaunee and their European neighbors that each would travel their own path, the Europeans in their ships, the Haudenosaunee in their canoes, without interfering with the other's journey. The white beads between the purple lines represented the peace that would exist between them, the river of respect that would keep their vessels from colliding. This principle of parallel sovereignty would later be tested in ways the original negotiators could never have imagined. But its wisdom lay not in its specific applications, but in its recognition that different peoples could coexist without one having to dominate or assimilate the other. It acknowledged that diversity itself was valuable, that the world was large enough for many different ways of living. That strength came not from uniformity, but from the creative tension between different approaches to the challenges of existence. Great Law's approach to leadership selection revealed sophistication insights into human psychology and the corrupting effects of power. Chiefs were not chosen because they sought authority, but precisely because they had demonstrated their willingness to serve without seeking personal gain. The very act of campaigning for office was seen as evidence of unfitness to hold it, for those who craved power were least likely to exercise it wisely. Instead, the clan mothers observed the young men of their communities over many years, watching for those who showed natural leadership qualities, not the flashy charisma that could sway crowds, but the quiet competence that earned trust, the patient wisdom that could find solutions to difficult problems, the moral courage that would choose right over easy. When such a man reached maturity, he might find himself approached by the clan mothers and informed that his people needed his service. The installation ceremony for new chiefs was designed to impress upon them the weight of their responsibilities, while surrounding them with the support they would need to fulfill their duties. The ceremony began with the ritual death of their former identity. They were symbolically buried, their old names forgotten, their personal desires set aside. They were then reborn as servants of their people, given new names that reflected their role in the Confederacy's governance, clothed in the regalia that marked their office. The antlers that crowned a chief's head were not decorations but reminders of the natural world's gifts and the responsibility to protect those gifts for future generations. The feathers in his headband represented the birds whose flight connected earth and sky, reminding him that leadership required the ability to see both immediate needs and distant possibilities. The wampum strings that adorned his clothing told the stories of his people, ensuring that he would never forget the history that had brought them to this moment. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the installation ceremony was its emphasis on the temporary nature of the chief's authority. Even as he was elevated to his position, he was reminded that his power came from the people and could be recalled by them at any time. The clan mothers who had chosen him retained the right to remove him, and the ceremony itself acknowledged that all earthly authority was temporary, that death would eventually claim every leader, that the institutions they served were greater and more enduring than any individual. This understanding of leadership as service rather than privilege extended to every level of Haudenosaunee society. Village councils operated on the same principles as the Grand Council, with decisions made through consensus rather than majority rule. This process was often slow and sometimes frustrating, but it ensured that decisions, once made, had the support of the entire community. No one was compelled to obey rules they had not helped to create. No one was excluded from the discussions that would shape their lives. The Great Law also recognized the special role of young people in ensuring the Confederacy's future. While they did not hold formal political power, they were given voice in council discussions, particularly when decisions would affect their generation most strongly. The Pine Tree Chiefs, chosen from among outstanding young men regardless of their clan affiliation, provided a pathway for exceptional talent to contribute to governance. Even if they had not been born into traditional leadership roles, women's influence extended far beyond their role as clan mothers. While they did not speak directly in the men's councils, they gathered in their own councils to discuss the issues of the day, and their conclusions were carried to the men's councils by designated speakers. This system ensured that both male and female perspectives were heard on every important matter, that decisions reflected the full wisdom of the community rather than just half of it. The children of the Haudenosaunee grew up surrounded by these examples of democratic participation, learning through observation and gradual involvement how societies could govern themselves without resort to force or coercion. They saw their parents engaged in thoughtful discussion of community issues, witnessed the careful process by which decisions were reached, observed the respect with which different viewpoints were treated. They learned that disagreement was not disloyalty, that questioning authority was not rebellion, that the health of the community depended on the active engagement of all its members. Education under the Great Law was not confined to formal instruction, but permeated every aspect of daily life. Children learned history through the stories told around winter fires, absorbed political principles through their participation in community meetings, developed their understanding of justice through the resolution of disputes they witnessed or experienced. They learned to see themselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of an intricate web of relationships that connected them to their families, their clans, their nations, their confederacy, the natural world, and the spiritual realm. The Great Law's approach to justice reflected this understanding of interconnectedness. Crime was seen not as an abstract violation of rules, but as a tear in the social fabric that needed to be repaired. The focus was always on restoration. How could the harm be undone? How could the relationships be healed? How could the community be made whole again? This approach required the active participation of all affected parties: the victim, the perpetrator, their families, the broader community. The process began with a recognition of the harm that had been done, not just to individuals but to the community as a whole. The perpetrator was required to acknowledge their actions and their consequences, to understand how their choices had affected others. But this acknowledgement was not meant to humiliate or ostracize. It was the first step in a process of healing that would eventually allow the perpetrator to be reintegrated into the community as a trusted member. Restitution took many forms, depending on the nature of the crime and the needs of those affected. Sometimes it involved material compensation, replacing stolen goods, providing labor to repair damage, caring for the victim's family if they had been injured. But often the most important elements of restitution were symbolic and spiritual. Acknowledgement of wrongdoing, participation in purification ceremonies, commitment to changed behavior in the future. The clan mothers played a crucial role in this process, serving as both advocates for justice and guardians of mercy. They ensured that victims' needs were addressed, while also protecting perpetrators from excessive punishment or permanent ostracism. They understood that a community that expelled its troublemakers, rather than helping them change, was ultimately weakening itself, losing not only the potential contributions of those individuals, but also the opportunity to demonstrate its own values of forgiveness and redemption. This system of restorative justice extended to conflicts between entire clans or nations within the Confederacy. When disputes arose that could not be resolved at the local level, they were brought before the Grand Council, where they were addressed through the same principles of acknowledgement, restitution, and reconciliation that governed individual cases. The goal was never to determine which party was right and which was wrong, but to find a solution that would allow all parties to move forward together. The Great Law thus created not just a system of government, but a way of life, a culture that valued wisdom over cleverness, cooperation over competition, harmony over dominance. It recognized that human beings were fallible creatures who needed structure and guidance to live together peacefully. But it also trusted in their fundamental capacity for goodness, their ability to choose community over selfishness when given the opportunity and the support to do so. As the forest kingdoms flourished under this system, their influence began to spread beyond their original boundaries. Other peoples, witnessing the peace and prosperity that the Great Law had brought to the Haudenosaunee, began to inquire about the principles that made such harmony possible. Delegations arrived from distant nations, eager to learn how conflicts could be resolved without warfare, how diverse peoples could unite without losing their distinctiveness, how power could be exercised without corruption. The great tree of peace continued to grow, its branches reaching ever wider, its roots extending ever deeper. Beneath its spreading canopy, the children of many nations played together, learning the games and songs and stories that would bind them together across the generations. The eagles that nested in its highest branches could see vast distances, their keen eyes watching for threats to the peace, their powerful wings ready to carry messages to the farthest reaches of the Confederacy's influence. And still the tree grew, nurtured by the tears of those who had known war and chosen peace, strengthened by the hopes of those who dared to believe that human beings could indeed learn to live together in harmony, sustained by the faith of those who understood that the work of peace was never finished but must be taken up anew by each generation, as natural and necessary as the rising of the sun each morning over the endless forests where freedom had learned to make its home within the longhouses, where smoke curled upward through carefully crafted openings toward the stars. The true essence of Haudenosaunee life unfolded like the petals of a woodland flower greeting the dawn. The governance that bound the nations was but the visible trunk of a vast tree, whose roots ran deep into the earth of tradition, whose branches stretched wide to embrace every aspect of existence in the forest kingdom. In the gentle pre-dawn light that filtered through the bark walls of the longhouses, the clan mothers stirred first, their movements as quiet as deer stepping through morning mist. These women, chosen not for their beauty or wealth, but for their wisdom and strength of character, held within their hands the very future of the Haudenosaunee. Their authority flowed not from conquest or accumulation, but from the sacred responsibility of nurturing life itself. The clan mother of the Wolf clan in the Mohawk Nation, Onondaga, moved through her longhouse with the grace of someone who understood that every action rippled outward like stones cast into still water. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of tending corn and children alike, carried the power to name and depose chiefs, to speak in council, to guide the destiny of thousands. Yet she wielded this power as gently as she would hold a newborn, understanding that true strength lay not in force but in the patient cultivation of harmony, that the longhouse itself reflected this feminine wisdom. Stretching sometimes 200 feet in length, these structures housed entire extended families, with the clan mother at the heart of the dwelling like the central hearth around which all life revolved. The bark walls, carefully sewn together, with basswood fiber breathed with the seasons, expanding in summer warmth and contracting in winter cold. A living architecture that moved in rhythm with the natural world. Each clan mother knew the genealogy of her people as intimately as a maple knows its rings. She could trace the bloodlines back through generations, understanding how each family connected to the greater whole. When young people sought marriage partners, she guided them away from unions that would weaken the clan's spiritual and physical health. When children were born, she watched for the signs that would reveal their gifts and their place in the great web of relationships that bound the people together. The clan mothers met in circles that excluded no voice, yet spoke with authority, that commanded respect from the mightiest warriors. Their deliberations moved like rivers finding their course to the sea, following the path of greatest harmony rather than the route of greatest speed. In the Turtle clan of the Onondaga, the clan mother Gianashagawa spent her days teaching the young girls the intricate patterns of beadwork that told the stories of their people. Each design carried meaning deeper than decoration. The tree of peace with its 4 white roots extending to the 4 directions. The eagle perched atop watching. For danger, the bundle of arrows representing the strength found in unity. As her fingers guided those of her students, she spoke in the soft, rhythmic cadences that made even complex lessons feel like lullabies. The authority of the clan mothers extended far beyond their individual longhouses. When the chiefs gathered in the great councils, it was the clan mothers who had chosen them, who could recall them if they strayed from the path of wisdom, who held the final word on matters of war and peace. This was not a power seized through violence or inherited through accident of birth, but an authority earned through decades of service, tested through countless small decisions that proved their commitment to the welfare of all people, young. Ayana of the Bear Clan learned these lessons as she followed her grandmother through the endless tasks that marked the seasons. In spring, they planted the 3 sisters together. Ayana's small hands dropping corn kernels into hills, carefully prepared by her grandmother's experienced fingers. The old woman spoke as they worked, her voice blending with the sound of wind. Through budding leaves, the corn feeds the body, child, but watch how the beans climb the stalks, how the squash spreads wide to shade the earth. Each helps the others, each gives what it can. This is how people must live. The clan mothers understood that their influence extended beyond the human world into the realm of spirits and ceremonies. They were the keepers of the sacred seeds, storing each variety of corn in special baskets woven with prayers and blessed with tobacco smoke. When drought threatened or insects plagued the crops, it was the clan mothers who organized the ceremonies needed to restore balance. Their knowledge of plants included not only which varieties yielded the most food, but which held medicine, which called to specific spirits, which must be gathered only at certain times, under particular conditions, as the seasons turned their ancient wheel through the forest kingdom. The Haudenosaunee marked each transition with ceremonies that wove the people more deeply into the fabric of creation. These were not rituals performed by a separate priestly class, but celebrations that involved entire communities, from the smallest children to the most venerable elders. The ceremonial calendar followed the rhythm of the natural world, acknowledging the gifts of creation and maintaining the reciprocal relationships that kept the world in balance. The midwinter ceremony, Iroquois, arrived when the days reached their shortest point and the earth slept beneath its blanket of snow. In the longhouses, fires burned brighter against the darkness, and the people gathered to give thanks for their survival through the hardest season. The ceremonies lasted for days, with stirring of ashes symbolizing the renewal of fire, the naming of children born during the year, and the recitation of the Thanksgiving address that acknowledged every aspect of creation from the earth beneath their feet to the Creator above the sky, above the sky. Tokahaya, a young man of the Seneca Nation, participated in his first adult midwinter ceremony with a heart full of wonder and nervousness. As the longhouse filled with families bundled in their finest clothing, decorated with porcupine quills and moose hair embroidery that caught the firelight like captured stars, he felt the weight of belonging, of being woven into something larger than himself. The speeches of thanksgiving began before dawn and continued until the first light of the new day, each word carefully chosen to honor the complex relationships that sustained life. The ceremony of the thunder beings marked the return of spring, when the first thunderstorms awakened the earth from its winter sleep. The Haudenosaunee understood thunder not as mere weather, but as the voices of powerful spirits, who brought the rains that fed the growing things. Children learned to greet the thunder with respect rather than fear. understanding that these sky beings cleared the air of evil influences and renewed the world with their dramatic displays of power. Seed blessing ceremony preceded the planting season, when the clan mothers brought forth the precious varieties of corn, beans, and squash that had been carefully preserved through the winter. Each seed was blessed with tobacco, smoke, and prayers, acknowledged as a gift from the Creator that would multiply into abundance if treated with proper respect. The ceremony reminded the people of their responsibility to the plant nations, their obligation to tend the earth with the same care the earth showed in feeding them. The ceremonies moved through the longhouses like gentle rivers, carrying prayers and gratitude to every corner of the community. No one watched from the sidelines. Every person, from toddling children to elders leaning on walking sticks, had a role to play in maintaining the spiritual health of the people. Strawberry ceremonies celebrated the first fruits of the earth, when the small, sweet berries ripened. In forest clearings and meadows, the people gathered to give thanks for this first gift of the growing season, understanding that the strawberries were messengers from the plant world, promises of the abundance to come. Children competed to see who could find the largest berries, their laughter echoing through the woods as their parents followed behind, offering quiet prayers of gratitude. The green corn ceremony marked the point when the corn reached milk stage, tender and sweet, but not yet mature. This was a time of great celebration, for it meant the people would survive another year, that the compact between humans and the plant nations remained strong. The ceremony lasted for 4 days, with feasting, dancing, and games that strengthened the bonds between families and clans. As summer reached its peak, the people celebrated the bean ceremony and the squash ceremony, honoring each of the 3 sisters in turn. These ceremonies recognized not only the practical gifts of these plants, but their spiritual significance as teachers. The corn showed how to stand tall and strong. The beans demonstrated the power of cooperation and mutual support, and the squash illustrated how to spread abundance widely while protecting what lay beneath. Harvest ceremony, or Nyan Wension, brought the agricultural year to its climax as the people gathered to give thanks for the earth's generosity. The longhouse is filled with the fruits of their labor. Corn in dozens of varieties, beans in colors that ranged from deep purple to speckled white, squash that could feed a family through the winter months. But the ceremony acknowledged more than food. It recognized the relationships of reciprocity that made such abundance possible. Throughout all these ceremonies, the Thanksgiving address served as the foundation, reminding the people of their place in the web of creation. The address began with gratitude to the earth, acknowledging it as mother of all life, then moved systematically through every aspect of creation: the waters that cleanse and nourish, the fish that provide sustenance, the plants that offer food and medicine, the animals that give their lives so humans might live, the trees that provide shelter and materials, the birds that bring messages and beauty, the winds that carry away what is no longer needed, the thunder beings that cleanse, the air, the sun that gives energy to all growing things, the moon that governs the waters and women's cycles, the stars that provide guidance and inspiration, and finally the Creator who set all these relationships in motion, the rhythm of Tadodaho. Life followed the ancient pulse of the seasons with a precision that made their communities seem like extensions of the forest itself. Each month brought its own activities, its own challenges and gifts, its own way of strengthening the bonds between the people and their homeland. This seasonal round was not merely a matter of survival, but a complex dance of reciprocity that honored the gifts of creation while ensuring their continuation. In the time the Haudenosaunee called the moon of the long nights, when snow lay deep in the forest and the deciduous trees stood like dark calligraphy against the winter sky, the people turned their attention inward to the longhouses. This was the season of storytelling, when the elders shared the traditional narratives that carried the wisdom of generations. The stories were not mere entertainment, but sacred repositories of knowledge about how to live in harmony with the world. Gagwa, an elder of the Cayuga Nation, gathered the children around the central fire as the wind howled through the bare branches outside. His voice, weathered by decades of speaking these same stories, took on the rhythmic cadences that had been perfected over centuries of telling. He spoke of Sky Woman's fall from the celestial realm, of how the animals helped create the earth. On Turtle's back, of the twin brothers whose rivalry shaped the landscapes of the world. Each story carried layers of meaning that the children would understand more deeply as they grew, teachings about cooperation, about the consequences of choices, about the fundamental interconnectedness of all life. Winter was also the season of crafts, when the women worked on the complex beadwork and embroidery that adorned ceremonial clothing, when the men carved wooden bowls and fashioned tools from bone and antler. These activities were not merely practical but deeply spiritual. Each design and technique passed down through generations of makers who understood that beauty and function were inseparable aspects of a life lived in harmony with creation. Young Orenda learned to weave baskets during these winter evenings, her fingers gradually mastering the intricate patterns that her grandmother demonstrated with endless patience. The black ash splints had to be prepared months in advance, the tree carefully selected, and the bark peeled at just the right time when the sap was rising. The geometric patterns that emerged from the weaving were not mere decoration, but symbols that connected the maker to the deeper patterns that governed the universe. The winter months moved slowly, like honey poured from a wooden spoon, giving the people time to repair what had been damaged, to reflect on the lessons of the previous year, to prepare their hearts and minds for the burst of activity that would come with spring's return. As the moon of the popping trees gave way to the moon of the suckerfish, the people began to stir from their winter contemplation. The maple trees, their trunks swelling with sweet sap, called the people back into active relationship with the forest. The tapping of the maples was both practical necessity and sacred ceremony, for the tree's gift of sweetness came only to those who approached with proper respect and gratitude. Diganoda, named for the great Peacemaker, helped his uncles prepare for the maple harvest with the excitement of a young person experiencing the season's first real promise of spring's return. They selected trees carefully, understanding that the maple's generosity had limits that must be respected. Too many taps would weaken the tree. Too large a tap would damage it permanently. The relationship between human and tree required the same careful attention as any friendship, built on mutual respect and reciprocal care. The maple camps were temporary villages, clusters of bark shelters erected near groves of sugar maples, with cooking fires that burned day and night as the sap was boiled down to syrup and sugar. Children ran between the trees, checking the bark, collecting vessels, and learning to read the signs that indicated when the sap was running well. The work was hard, but it was also joyful, marking as it did the earth's awakening from winter sleep, as spring advanced into the moon of the flowers. The people turned their attention to the three sisters, the corn, beans, and squash that formed the foundation of their agricultural system. The planting was a community effort that brought together families and clans in celebrations of cooperation that strengthened social bonds while ensuring that no family went without the basic necessities of life. The fields were not the geometric rectangles of European agriculture, but carefully tended forest clearings where the trees had been killed by girdling rather than complete removal. The standing dead trees provided support for the beans, while the partially cleared forest created a complex ecosystem that supported both cultivated and wild plants. The cornhills were spaced widely enough to allow squash to sprawl between them, creating a living carpet that conserved moisture and prevented weeds while maximizing the use of available space. Tekahianwake, a young woman of the Oneida Nation approaching her first full season as an adult gardener, learned from her mother and aunts the subtle knowledge that made the difference between adequate and abundant harvests. She learned to read the signs in the soil, to understand when the earth was ready to receive seeds, to recognize the difference between good and poor planting weather. More importantly, she learned the ceremonies and prayers that maintained the spiritual relationships that made agriculture possible. Summer brought the moon of the strawberries, the moon of the big ripening, and the moon of the three sisters, each marking different stages in the agricultural cycle. The people moved between their villages and their fields, tending the growing plants with the same care they showed their children. The work was constant but not overwhelming, for the Haudenosaunee had learned to work with rather than against the natural systems of their homeland. The forest provided abundance that supplemented the agricultural harvest. Wild greens appeared in spring before the cultivated plants were ready, providing essential nutrients after the long winter months. Berries ripened in succession throughout the summer, each variety offering its own gifts of flavor and medicine. Nuts fell in autumn, providing protein and oils that could be stored through the winter. Medicinal plants were gathered at specific times when their potency was greatest, always with ceremonies that acknowledged the plant's sacrifice and ensured that enough remained to continue the species in the quiet depths of the forest, where ancient trees stood like living cathedrals and streams whispered secrets to the moss-covered stones. The Haudenosaunee learned the language of healing that had been spoken since the world began. Their medicine ways were not separate from their daily lives, but woven through every aspect of existence, like golden threads in a tapestry, connecting the physical health of the body to the spiritual health of the community and the environmental health of the homeland. Skanyadario, whose name meant beautiful lake, served as a medicine person for several Seneca villages. Her knowledge accumulated through decades of patient observation and careful teaching from the elders who had preceded her. She moved through the forest with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that every plant, every stone, every stream held potential medicine for those who approached with proper respect and understanding. Her medicine bag, made from the hide of a deer that had given its life willingly, contained tools and substances gathered from throughout the forest kingdom: sweetgrass for purification ceremonies, tobacco for prayers and offerings, sage for cleansing negative energies, cedar for protection and grounding. But her true medicine lay not in the bag, but in her understanding of the relationships that connected all aspects of healing. The Haudenosaunee understood illness not as random misfortune, but as a sign of imbalance, either within the individual or within the community's relationship to the natural world. Healing required addressing not only the physical symptoms, but the spiritual and social causes that had allowed disease to take hold. A person's illness might stem from neglected ceremonies, from conflicts within the family, from failure to maintain proper relationships with the spirit world, or from violations of the natural laws that governed healthy living. The forest itself was the greatest teacher of medicine, showing through countless examples how life maintained balance, how systems healed themselves, how apparent death led to renewed growth. the medicine people learned to read these lessons and apply them to human healing. Oswego, a young man called to the medicine path by dreams that came repeatedly through several seasons, began his training by learning to observe the forest with new eyes. His teacher, an old woman whose name was known only to the spirits, guided him through the woods in all seasons, teaching him to recognize the hundreds of plants that offered healing to those who understood their proper use. The willow trees that grew along the streams provided medicine for pain and fever, their bark carefully harvested in spring when the healing compounds were most concentrated. The elder bushes offered their berries for immune system support and their flowers for respiratory ailments. The echinacea that bloomed in forest clearings strengthened the body's ability to fight infection, while the ginseng that grew in the deep shade provided energy and vitality for those whose life force had been depleted by illness or age. But knowing which plants to use was only the beginning of the medicine person's education. Each plant had to be approached with ceremony, with prayers that acknowledged its sacrifice and asked for its cooperation in the healing process. The gathering itself was a sacred act that required understanding of proper timing, correct methods, and appropriate offerings. A plant gathered without ceremony, without respect, without understanding of its spiritual nature, might provide no healing at all. The preparation of medicines followed equally strict protocols. Roots were dried in the shade to preserve their potency, leaves were gathered at specific times of day when their active compounds were most concentrated, and bark was peeled in spirals that followed the tree's natural growth patterns. The medicine person had to understand not only what to use, but how to prepare it, how to combine different plants for maximum effectiveness, and how to adjust dosages for different ages and conditions. Healing ceremonies often involved the entire community, for the Haudenosaunee understood that individual health was inseparable from collective well-being. When someone fell seriously ill, the clans would gather to examine what imbalances in the community might have contributed to the person's condition. Had ceremonies been neglected? Had conflicts been allowed to fester? Had the people failed in their responsibilities to the natural world? The medicine societies, groups of people dedicated to specific types of healing, performed ceremonies that addressed both individual and community needs. The Medicine Lodge Society conducted elaborate rituals that could last for days, with singing, dancing, and drumming that helped restore the spiritual harmony necessary for healing. The Bear Society specialized in healing the wounds and ailments that came from violating taboos or failing to show proper respect to the animal nation's dreams. Played a crucial role in Haudenosaunee healing practices, for the people understood that the spirit world often communicated through the images and stories that came during sleep. Medicine people learned to interpret dreams not only for themselves but for others who sought guidance. A recurring dream might indicate a calling to a specific medicine practice, while a frightening dream might warn of illness or spiritual danger that could be prevented through appropriate ceremony. Gaihanarian, a middle-aged woman of the Onondaga nation, experienced dreams that showed her specific plants and their uses, knowledge that came directly from the spirits rather than from human teachers. She learned to trust these visions, testing their guidance carefully and finding that the dream medicine often proved more effective than treatments learned through conventional means. Her reputation as a healer grew not from her accumulation of techniques but from her ability to listen to the spiritual guidance that flowed through the dream world into the waking realm. The healing practices extended beyond the treatment of physical ailments to include what modern people might call psychological and social healing. The Haudenosaunee recognized that grief, anger, fear, and other strong emotions could cause illness if not properly addressed. They developed elaborate systems for helping people process traumatic experiences, resolve conflicts, and maintain the emotional balance necessary for community harmony. The condolence ceremony provided a structured way for communities to deal with the death of important leaders, helping the people move through their grief while ensuring that the deceased person's responsibilities were properly transferred to successors. The ceremony acknowledged that death created an imbalance that affected the entire community, not just the immediate family, and that healing required collective action to restore harmony beyond the carefully tended gardens and the smoke wreath. Longhouses, the vast forest pulsed with teachers whose lessons came not in words, but in the patient demonstration of how to live in perfect balance with the world. The Haudenosaunee understood that the animal nations were not mere resources to be exploited, but relatives whose wisdom, if properly observed and respected, could guide human communities toward greater harmony and understanding. Each animal carried specific gifts of knowledge, specific teachings about how to navigate the challenges of existence in the forest kingdom. The deer taught about gentleness and alertness, showing how to move through the world with grace while remaining constantly aware of potential dangers. The bear demonstrated the importance of seasonal rhythms, the wisdom of gathering abundance during times of plenty and resting deeply during times of scarcity. The wolf showed the power of family cooperation, the way individual strength could be multiplied through loyal partnership and shared responsibility. Hiawatha, a young hunter of the Mohawk Nation, learned these lessons through patient observation that began in childhood and continued throughout his life. His grandfather, Onondaga, taught him that successful hunting required more than skill with bow and arrow. It demanded understanding of animal behavior, respect for the spirits that governed the forest, and acceptance of the responsibility that came with taking life to sustain life. The relationship between hunter and prey was governed by elaborate protocols that ensured the spiritual balance necessary for the continued abundance of game. Before any hunt, ceremonies were performed to ask permission from the animal spirits, to explain the need that drove the hunt, and to promise that nothing would be wasted from whatever animals chose to give their lives. Hunters underwent purification, rituals that cleansed them of negative thoughts or selfish motivations that might interfere with the sacred exchange. The animals were understood to be willing participants in a cosmic dance of reciprocity, giving their bodies to sustain human life in exchange for ceremonies that honored their sacrifice and ensured the spiritual continuation of their kind. The beaver taught lessons about engineering and cooperation, their dams demonstrating how intelligent work could transform entire landscapes for the benefit of many species. The Haudenosaunee observed how beaver families worked together to maintain their constructions, how they planned for seasonal changes, how their activities created wetlands that supported countless other forms of life. These observations influenced human engineering projects, teaching the people to work with natural water flows rather than against them. Eagles and hawks, soaring high above the forest canopy, served as messengers between the earthbound human communities in the realm of the spirits. Their keen eyesight and ability to see patterns from great heights made them symbols of clarity and farsightedness. When important decisions needed to be made, the people watched the behavior of these great birds, understanding that their flights and calls might carry guidance from the spirit world. Otsitsia, a young woman gifted with the ability to understand bird language, spent her mornings listening to the complex conversations that took place in the forest canopy as the day began. She learned that the birds were not merely making random sounds, but sharing specific information about weather changes, the movement of predators, the location of food sources, and the overall health of the forest ecosystem. This knowledge helped her people prepare for storms, locate resources, and understand the subtle changes that indicated shifts in the natural world's balance. The smaller animals provided equally important teachings. Squirrels demonstrated the importance of preparation and storage, showing how to gather abundance during times of plenty and preserve it for leaner periods. Their elaborate cache systems, hidden throughout their territories, inspired human food storage techniques that could sustain communities through long winters or unexpected shortages. Rabbits and other small mammals taught about survival through awareness and adaptability, their ability to remain motionless when danger threatened, to find shelter in the smallest spaces, to move quickly when escape was necessary, provided models for human behavior in times of conflict or uncertainty. The Haudenosaunee warriors studied these animals carefully, learning stealth techniques that could mean the difference between life and death in hostile territory. The relationship with animals extended beyond observation to direct communication and partnership. Many Haudenosaunee people developed special relationships with particular animal spirits, receiving guidance and protection in exchange for ceremony and respect. These relationships were not taken lightly, but were understood to create obligations that lasted throughout a person's life. Iroquois, a medicine person specializing in animal healing, learned to communicate with the spirits of injured or sick animals, understanding that their well-being was connected to the health of the entire forest community. She developed techniques for treating wounded deer, for helping lost birds find their way, for assisting animals whose natural behaviors had been disrupted by human activities. Her work recognized that human health was inseparable from the health of the animal nations with whom they shared the forest. The seasonal movements of animals provided a calendar that guided human activities throughout the year. The return of migratory birds signaled the proper time for specific ceremonies and activities. The behavior of deer indicated when harsh weather was approaching. The activity levels of bears showed when it was time to begin preparations for winters. Long sleep. Even the insects and smaller creatures served as teachers. Ants demonstrated the power of collective effort, showing how small individuals working together could accomplish tasks that seemed impossible for any single creature. Bees revealed the secrets of complex social organization and the importance of every individual's contribution to the welfare of the whole. Spiders taught about patience and the power of creating structures that could capture what was needed while allowing what wasn't needed to pass through harmlessly. The teaching extended to understanding the relationships between different animal species, the complex web of predator and prey, cooperation and competition that kept the forest ecosystem in dynamic balance. The Haudenosaunee learned to see themselves as part of this web rather than separate from it, understanding that their actions as hunters, gatherers, and land managers affected the well-being of all the creatures with whom they shared the forest. Fish in the streams and lakes provided their own teachings about flowing with natural currents, about the importance of returning to one's birthplace, about the cycles of abundance and scarcity that governed life in the water realm. The seasonal runs of salmon and other fish provided not only food but lessons about determination, about the power of following ancient patterns, about the way individual sacrifice could ensure the continuation of the species as the seasons turned, and the years accumulated like fallen leaves. The people of the forest kingdom continued to learn from their animal teachers, each generation adding to the accumulated wisdom while ensuring that the essential teachings were passed on to their children. The animals remained patient instructors, demonstrating through their lives the principles that could guide human communities toward greater harmony, greater sustainability, greater understanding of their place in the vast web of relationships that connected all life in the endless forest. In the quiet moments between dawn and full daylight, when the mist rose from the streams and the forest stirred with the gentle movements of creatures beginning their daily routines, the Haudenosaunee people offered prayers of gratitude to their animal teachers. These prayers acknowledged the gifts received, the lessons learned, the ongoing relationships that bound all the nations of the forest together in the great dance of existence that had been spinning since the world began. The teachings of the animal nations were not mere folklore or primitive superstition, but sophisticated ecological knowledge that had been tested and refined through countless generations of careful observation. This knowledge enabled the Haudenosaunee to live in sustainable relationship with their environment, taking what they needed while ensuring that the forest ecosystems remained healthy and productive for future generations of all species. The wisdom of the animals became woven into every aspect of Haudenosaunee culture, from the clan system that organized their society to the ceremonies that marked their seasons, from the techniques they used for hunting and gathering to the stories they told their children. The Forest Kingdom was not merely the place where the people lived, but a community of teachers whose lessons shaped every aspect of how they understood themselves and their responsibilities to the world. As the sun climbed higher and the morning mist dissolved into the warming air, the forest settled into the comfortable rhythm of another day, the eternal dance of teaching and learning, giving and receiving, that connected all its inhabitants in the web of relationships that made life not merely possible but beautiful, meaningful, and sacred. The Haudenosaunee people moved through this web as students and teachers both, learning from the animal nations while sharing their own gifts of ceremony, gratitude, and conscious participation in the great mystery that bound all existence together in the endless, ever-changing, ever-sacred forest of their homeland. Their sacred counsels had guided them through countless seasons of harmony, but now the forest itself seemed to whisper of changes coming with the wind from across the great waters. In the early morning mists of the 16th century, when the world still turned on rhythms older than memory, the first pale-skinned strangers appeared along the edges of Haudenosaunee territory like phantoms emerging from dreams. They came not as the nations had always come, with proper protocols and kinship ties stretching back through generations, but as something entirely new under the Sunmen, whose very presence seemed to bend the ancient patterns of the forest world. The Mohawk villagers closest to the great river valleys were the first to encounter these peculiar visitors. Dutch traders, their boats heavy with goods that gleamed like captured starlight, spoke in tongues no medicine person had ever heard in vision or dream. They brought with them objects that seemed to hold power of their own, metal that could cut wood like water, fire sticks that spoke with thunder, and strange cloths woven with colors that had never bloomed in any forest flower. Yet for all their strangeness, these newcomers showed a hunger that the Haudenosaunee recognized, not the clean hunger of the wolf for the deer, which was part of the sacred balance, but something else, something that seemed to grow larger with each feeding. They spoke constantly of beaver, their eyes brightening like flames when the word was mentioned, and they spread before the sachems piles of goods that multiplied like leaves in autumn. The clan mothers gathered in council, their voices weaving through the Longhouse smoke as they considered this new element in their world. Some saw opportunity in these strange visitors, a chance to acquire tools that could make life easier, weapons that could ensure their people's safety. Others felt the deep unease that comes when the patterns that have sustained life for countless generations begin to shift beneath one's feet. Hiawatha's great vision had spoken of a tree whose roots spread in 4 directions, welcoming all who would shelter beneath its branches. But what of those who came not seeking shelter, but bearing axes? The question hung in the Longhouse air like the smoke from the sacred fires, never quite settling, never quite dispersing, that as the moons turned and the seasons cycled, more ships appeared on the rivers and along the great water's edge. French voyageurs paddled up the northern waterways, their canoes cutting through the morning stillness like knives through silk. English settlers cleared forests to the south and east, their axes ringing against ancient trunks with a rhythm that spoke of permanence rather than the seasonal give and take that had always governed the relationship between the people and the land. The Haudenosaunee watched, listened, and adapted as they always had. They had survived ice ages and droughts, had weathered migrations and famines, had negotiated the complex web of relationships that bound nation to nation across the vast continent. These new arrivals were simply another element to be understood, another thread to be woven into the great pattern of existence. But the thread these strangers brought was unlike any other, where indigenous nations fought for honor, for territory, for the maintenance of proper relationships. These newcomers seemed driven by an entirely different vision of what the world should be. They spoke of ownership in ways that made no sense, to people who understood that the land belonged to itself, that humans were merely its temporary caretakers. They brought diseases that swept through villages like wildfire, leaving behind a silence that the forest had never known. In the face of these challenges, the great law proved its wisdom once again. Rather than retreating or striking out blindly, the Confederacy chose the path of careful engagement. They would trade with these newcomers, learn their ways, understand their weaknesses and strengths. They would maintain their own sovereignty while navigating this new world that was emerging around them like morning fog lifting from familiar valleys to reveal an entirely transformed landscape. The beaver, that industrious builder whose dams had shaped so many of the waterways through Haudenosaunee territory, became the bridge between worlds. European demand for beaver pelts created opportunities for indigenous hunters and traders, but it also began to alter the ancient relationships that had governed human interaction with the animal nations, where once the taking of beaver had been governed by ceremony and seasonal wisdom, by the need to maintain balance between all the forest's children. Now it became driven by the insatiable appetite of distant markets. Villages that had known abundance for generations suddenly found their streams empty of the animals, whose engineering had created the wetlands that supported countless other forms of life. As the 17th century deepened like shadows in an old-growth forest, the competition for beaver territories grew fierce enough to wake sleeping thunderbirds. The Five Nations found themselves at the center of a storm that swept across the eastern woodlands with the fury of a late-season tornado, leaving changed landscapes in its wake. The Huron Confederacy to the north, longtime rivals and occasional allies, had established themselves as intermediaries between the French traders at Quebec and the fur-rich territories of the upper Great Lakes. Their canoes moved like schools of fish through the waterways, carrying French goods westward and bringing back the pelts that fed the hungry markets of Europe. But their success came at a cost that the Haudenosaunee could not ignore. The Huron were growing wealthy and powerful, while controlling access to resources that had once flowed freely among all the forest peoples. The Dutch, at Fort Orange, nestled in the valley of the great river they called the Hudson, offered a different vision of trade. They dealt directly with the Mohawk and their Confederacy brothers, providing firearms and metal goods in exchange for furs. But as beaver populations dwindled in traditional Haudenosaunee hunting grounds, the pressure to expand into new territories grew like hunger during a long winter. War, when it came, arrived not as a sudden thunderclap, but as a gathering storm that darkened the sky gradually, inevitably. The Haudenosaunee had always been warriors when the situation demanded it, but their conflicts had traditionally been limited affairs: raids to take captives, battles to settle disputes, ceremonies of mourning war that helped heal the wounds left by loss. What emerged in the 1640s was something different. A sustained campaign that would reshape the entire political landscape of the northeastern woodlands. The Seneca, westernmost of the Five Nations, struck first at the neutral nation, those people who had long maintained their independence by refusing to take sides in the various conflicts that periodically swept through the region. But neutrality, it seemed, was a luxury that the New World Order could no longer afford. Villages that had known peace for generations suddenly found themselves under attack by warriors armed with European weapons and driven by the desperate need to secure new hunting grounds. As news of the Seneca victories spread through the Longhouses, the other nations of the Confederacy felt the pull of war like iron drawn to a lodestone. The Mohawk, always ready for battle, saw in the conflict an opportunity to break the Huron stranglehold on the northern trade routes. The Oneida, Onondaga, and Cayuga, traditionally more focused on diplomacy and spiritual matters, found themselves drawn into a conflict that seemed to offer no middle ground. The campaign against the Huron began in earnest in 1648 as autumn painted the forests in colors that seemed to echo the fire of conflict. Haudenosaunee war parties, now armed with Dutch muskets and moving with the tactical knowledge gleaned from decades of contact with European military thinking, swept through Huronia like a wind-driven blaze through dry grass. Village after village fell to the Confederacy forces. Some Huron communities were utterly destroyed, their people scattered to the winds or adopted into Haudenosaunee clans according to the ancient customs that turned enemies into family. Others negotiated their surrender, their leaders recognizing that resistance would only bring greater suffering. Still others melted away into the deep forest, carrying their sacred fires to distant refuges where they hoped to wait out the storm. The French, watching their indigenous trading partners disappear like morning mist, attempted to intervene. Jesuit missionaries who had lived among the Huron for years suddenly found themselves in the middle of a war zone, their black robes offering no protection against warriors who saw them as symbols of the very forces that had disrupted the ancient balance of power. Some of these priests became casualties of a conflict they barely understood, dying with the same courage they had shown in their attempts to transform indigenous souls. Others fled eastward, carrying with them stories of savage warfare that would color European perceptions of the forest peoples for generations to come. What they failed to understand, what they could never truly grasp, was that the Haudenosaunee were not fighting for conquest in the European sense, but for survival in a world that seemed to be shifting beneath their feet like ice breaking up on a spring river. By 1650, Huronia was no more. The once proud Confederacy that had controlled the trade routes to the west had been scattered to the four winds, its people either dead, adopted, or fled to distant refuges. The Haudenosaunee had secured their position as the dominant indigenous power in the northeastern woodlands, but the victory came at a cost that would echo through the Longhouses for generations. The warriors who returned from the campaigns brought with them not just captives and spoils of war, but stories that changed the very nature of Haudenosaunee society. They had seen entire villages burn, had witnessed the collapse of political systems that had endured for centuries, had participated in the reshaping of the world through violence on a scale that dwarfed anything in their people's collective memory. Some of these returning warriors settled back into the rhythms of Longhouse life, hanging up their weapons like farmers storing tools after harvest. Others found that the taste of war had become like salt water. The more they drank, the thirstier they became. The Confederacy found itself master of vast new territories, but also faced with the challenge of integrating thousands of new people into communities that had always prized consensus and careful balance. The clan mothers, those keepers of tradition and wisdom, worked tirelessly to weave the newcomers into the social fabric of their adopted nations. Children who had been Huron when the sun rose would sleep that night as Mohawk or Seneca, their identities transformed through ceremonies that had the power to make strangers into relatives. Adults who proved their worth and loyalty might find themselves elevated to positions of responsibility within their new communities, their foreign origins gradually forgotten as they contributed to the ongoing life of the people. But the wars were far from over. Having broken the Huron Confederacy, the Five Nations found themselves drawn deeper into the cycle of conflict that seemed to have been unleashed by the arrival of the Europeans. The Ottawa, Erie, and other nations that had previously existed on the periphery of Haudenosaunee influence now found themselves targeted for conquest or alliance. As the smoke of the beaver, wars settled over the transformed landscape of the Great Lakes region. The Haudenosaunee found themselves in a position that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. They stood astride the continent like a colossus, their influence extending from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi Valley, from the subarctic forests of Canada to the hills of Pennsylvania. Yet with this power came responsibilities and challenges that tested the very foundations of their democratic traditions. The longhouses that had once sheltered extended families now accommodated the complex logistics of governing a vast network of tributary nations and adopted peoples. Wampum belts that had recorded simple agreements between neighboring villages now documented treaties that affected the balance of power across half a continent. The Grand Council at Onondaga, that sacred fire around which the Confederacy had first taken shape, now received delegations from peoples whose very existence had been unknown when Hiawatha and the Peacemaker first planted the Tree of Great Peace. French officials in Quebec, watching their indigenous trading partners disappear or flee westward, began to reassess their relationship with the Haudenosaunee. Where once they had dismissed the Five Nations as troublesome neighbors to be managed or avoided, they now recognized them as a major power that could not be ignored. Governor-General Louis de Boyd de Frontenac, arriving in New France in 1672, brought with him a new understanding of North American realities. The Haudenosaunee were not just another indigenous group to be converted or conquered, but a sophisticated political entity with which France would have to negotiate as equals. The Dutch, whose traders had armed the Haudenosaunee war parties that had swept through Huronia, found their own position transformed by the changing political landscape when the English seized New Amsterdam in 1664, renaming it New York. The Confederacy faced the necessity of establishing relationships with yet another European power. The Covenant Chain, that great diplomatic innovation that would become the foundation of Haudenosaunee-European relations for the next century, emerged from these early negotiations like a silver rope binding together peoples who might otherwise have remained strangers. The English, newcomers to the complex world of northeastern woodland politics, initially struggled to understand the sophisticated diplomatic protocols that governed relationships between indigenous nations. They expected to deal with chiefs and kings, hierarchical structures that mirrored their own understanding of political authority. Instead, they encountered a system based on consensus, clan relationships, and the careful balance of spiritual and temporal power that had allowed the Confederacy to function for centuries. Slowly, through a series of conferences and negotiations that stretched across decades, both sides learned to speak each other's diplomatic languages. The English came to understand that treating with the Haudenosaunee meant navigating a complex web of relationships between nations, clans, and spiritual authorities. The Confederacy learned to present their collective decisions through spokesmen who could function as intermediaries between their consensus-based system and the European expectation of individual authority. The covenant chain that emerged from these negotiations was unlike any diplomatic instrument that had existed before in North American history. It bound together not just the English colonies and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but an entire network of allied indigenous nations that looked to the Five Nations for leadership and protection. The metaphor of the chain itself, links of silver that could be polished bright through regular attention, or allowed to tarnish through neglect, captured the dynamic nature of relationships that required constant renewal and care. Albany, that Dutch trading post that had become an English colonial town, evolved into the diplomatic capital of northeastern North America. Its meeting halls witnessed negotiations that determined the fate of nations, while its streets bustled with delegations representing peoples from across the continent. Mohawk sachems walked the same paths as Seneca war chiefs, Oneida clan mothers, Pennsylvania Quakers, Virginia planters, and Boston merchants, all drawn together by the magnetic pull of the covenant chain's promise of mutual prosperity and security. The Haudenosaunee approach to these negotiations reflected their deep understanding of the power of words and ceremony. Every treaty conference began with the ritual condolence, that ancient ceremony of healing that cleared the minds and hearts of all participants so that true communication could take place. Wampum belts changed hands like written documents, their patterns of purple and white shells encoding agreements that would be remembered and recited for generations to come. European observers, watching these elaborate ceremonies with varying degrees of comprehension, gradually came to appreciate the sophistication of Haudenosaunee diplomatic culture, the speeches that could last for days, the careful attention to protocol and precedent, the emphasis on consensus building rather than the simple imposition of will. All of these elements contributed to a style of international relations that was arguably more effective than anything being practiced in the courts of Europe through the 1670s and 1680s. The Confederacy used its growing diplomatic influence to consolidate its position as the dominant power in the northeastern woodlands. Nations that had previously been enemies or neutrals found themselves drawn into the Haudenosaunee sphere of influence, some through conquest, others through negotiation, still others through the simple recognition that alignment with the Five Nations offered the best hope for survival in a rapidly changing world. The Susquehannock, those fierce warriors who had controlled the river valleys south of Haudenosaunee territory, finally submitted after years of intermittent warfare. Their defeat opened the entire Chesapeake region to Confederacy influence, bringing the Five Nations into direct contact with the English colonies of Maryland and Virginia. Suddenly, Haudenosaunee war parties could strike at settlements along the Potomac River, while their diplomats could negotiate directly with the colonial governments that controlled the tobacco trade. To the west, the remnants of the scattered Huron Confederacy had regrouped around the French missions at Green Bay and Michilimackinac, but they remained vulnerable to Haudenosaunee pressure. Ottawa and Potawatomi communities found themselves caught between the advancing Five Nations and the French traders who depended on indigenous allies for their economic survival. Some chose to flee further west, carrying the cycle of displacement and conflict to the Great Plains. Others submitted to Haudenosaunee authority, accepting tributary status in exchange for protection and access to European trade goods. But power on this scale brought with it complications that the founders of the Great Peace could never have anticipated. The Confederacy found itself managing relationships not just between its own member nations, but between dozens of tributary peoples, each with their own histories, languages, and traditions. The consensus-based decision-making that had served the Five Nations so well when they were a regional power began to strain under the weight of continental responsibilities. Village councils that had once dealt with local matters, crop rotations, marriage disputes, the timing of seasonal ceremonies now found themselves debating questions of war and peace that affected peoples they had never seen, living in territories that existed only as names in the speeches of returning ambassadors, young warriors who had grown up hearing stories of their grandfathers, raids on neighboring villages now prepared for campaigns that might take them hundreds of miles from home, into landscapes and climates unlike anything in their ancestral memories. In the sacred council house at Onondaga, where the central fire of the Confederacy had burned without interruption since the time of the Peacemaker, the sachems gathered with increasing frequency to wrestle with problems that seemed to multiply like summer thunderstorms. The wampum belts that recorded their decisions now filled entire storage baskets, their patterns encoding a complex web of relationships that stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, from Hudson's Bay to the Carolinas. The 50 chiefs who sat in that circle had inherited a system designed for a simpler world. When the Haudenosaunee had been one confederacy among many, their influence extending only as far as a war party could travel in a season. Now they found themselves responsible for maintaining peace among dozens of formerly independent nations, each with its own grievances, ambitions, and understanding of proper relationships with both the spirit world and the increasingly complex realm of European colonial politics. The clan mothers, those keepers of tradition and wisdom who selected and advised the chiefs, worked tirelessly to adapt ancient institutions to new realities. The women's councils that had once focused on the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest now dealt with the logistics of feeding thousands of refugees. The complexities of integrating captives from dozens of different cultural backgrounds, and the delicate negotiations required to maintain harmony between peoples who had been enemies within living memory. Children who had been born into Huron or Erie families found themselves raised as Haudenosaunee, learning new languages, new ceremonies, new ways of understanding their place in the world. Some adapted easily, their young minds flexible enough to embrace identities that their birth parents could never have imagined. Others struggled with the contradictions between the stories their adopted families told and the half-remembered fragments of their earliest years. The longhouses themselves reflected these changes, where once each dwelling had sheltered members of a single clan, united by blood and tradition stretching back to the beginning of memory. Now many housed complex mixtures of peoples. A Seneca woman might find herself sharing her hearth with adopted Huron children. A captured French trader who had chosen to remain among his captors and refugees from the Erie Nation, whose very language was slowly being forgotten as its speakers died or assimilated. These human complexities were mirrored in the Confederacy's external relationships. The French in Quebec, having lost their indigenous trading partners in Huronia, alternated between attempts to negotiate with the Haudenosaunee and efforts to undermine their power through alliances with Western nations. French missionaries, their black robes now familiar sights in many Haudenosaunee communities, preached a gospel that both attracted and disturbed people who had their own ancient relationships with the spirit world. Some Haudenosaunee, particularly among the Mohawk who lived closest to European settlements, found in Christianity echoes of their own spiritual traditions. The notion of a great spirit who had created the world and continued to guide its development was not foreign to people who honored the Creator and followed the guidance of the Peacemaker. The emphasis on peace, forgiveness, and the care of the poor resonated with values that had long been central to Haudenosaunee culture. But others saw in the missionary message a threat to the very foundations of their way of life. Christianity demanded exclusive allegiance in ways that traditional Haudenosaunee spirituality did not, where indigenous beliefs had always been flexible enough to incorporate new insights and experiences. The missionary insistence on rejecting all previous spiritual relationships seemed to strike at the heart of what it meant to be Haudenosaunee. These religious divisions created new forms of tension within communities that had always prided themselves on their ability to maintain harmony despite differences of opinion. Families found themselves split between those who embraced the new faith and those who held to traditional ways. Villages divided into Christian and traditional factions, each viewing the other with suspicion and sometimes open hostility. The sachems at Onondaga watched these developments with the same careful attention they brought to all matters affecting the welfare of their people. They recognized the danger that religious conflict posed to the unity that had always been the Confederacy's greatest strength. Yet they also understood that the changing world required adaptations that might well include new forms of spiritual understanding. Their solution, when it came, reflected the pragmatic wisdom that had always characterized Haudenosaunee governance. Rather than attempting to impose religious uniformity, they chose to treat Christianity as they had always treated spiritual innovation, as a personal choice that should not be allowed to disrupt the social harmony essential to collective survival. Christian Haudenosaunee could participate fully in the political and social life of their communities as long as they continued to honor their obligations to clan and nation. This policy of religious tolerance, radical by European standards of the time, allowed the Confederacy to avoid the religious wars that were tearing apart communities throughout colonial North America. But it also created new complexities in relationships with European allies who expected their indigenous partners to demonstrate clear religious allegiance. The French, in particular, found it difficult to understand how the Haudenosaunee could maintain friendly relations with both Catholic and Protestant missionaries, while refusing to commit fully to either faith tradition. French officials, accustomed to the religious uniformity that characterized their own colonial policy, sometimes interpreted Haudenosaunee religious flexibility as evidence of diplomatic duplicity rather than spiritual sophistication. The English colonists, themselves divided between various Protestant denominations, proved somewhat more accepting of Haudenosaunee religious diversity. But they too struggled to understand a political system that could accommodate fundamental differences of belief without fragmenting into hostile factions. As the 17th century drew to a close, the Haudenosaunee found themselves facing challenges that tested every aspect of their traditional governance system. Their military success had made them the dominant indigenous power in northeastern North America. But it had also created responsibilities that strained their institutions and threatened the very consensus that had made their success possible. The great law of peace, that ancient constitution that had united 5 separate nations into a single confederacy, now had to accommodate the needs and interests of dozens of different peoples. The tree of great peace, whose roots were supposed to extend in 4 directions to welcome all who sought its shelter, now sheltered a forest of different traditions, languages, and ways of understanding the world. Yet somehow, through the wisdom of their leaders and the flexibility of their institutions, the Confederacy continued to function. The sacred fire at Onondaga continued to burn. The clan mothers continued to select chiefs who could navigate the complex realities of their expanded world. And the people continued to gather for the seasonal ceremonies that connected them to the deepest sources of their identity and strength in the Longhouses. As autumn gave way to winter and the stories of summer's events were woven into the collective memory of the people, the elders spoke of the great wheel of time that had brought their ancestors through countless challenges and transformations. The current difficulties, they reminded their listeners, were simply the latest turn of that wheel. The people who had survived the ice ages and the great migrations, who had learned to live in harmony with the forest and its creatures, who had created a political system based on peace and mutual respect, would find ways to adapt to whatever changes the future might bring. The forest itself seemed to echo this confidence. In the deep woods, where the ancient trees still stood, their roots intertwined in networks older than any human memory, the natural world continued its seasonal cycles with the same patient persistence that had always characterized life in the northeastern woodlands. The maple trees that had fed the people for countless generations continued to offer their gift of sweet sap each spring. The 3 sisters corn, beans, and squash continued to grow in the clearings where Haudenosaunee women tended them with the same careful attention their grandmothers had shown, and in the councils and longhouses, around the fires that connected each family to the great central fire of the Confederacy, the work of building consensus and maintaining harmony continued. It was slower work now, more complex, requiring greater patience and skill than their ancestors could have imagined. But it was still the same essential work that had always defined what it meant to be Haudenosaunee, the work of living together, in peace, of making decisions that served not just the present generation, but the 7 generations yet to come, of maintaining the balance between human needs and the larger web of relationships that sustained all life. The winter of 1777 brought more than snow to the longhouses of the Haudenosaunee. It brought the weight of an impossible choice, heavy as the ice that formed on the Mohawk River, sharp as the wind that cut through the ancient forests where their ancestors had walked for countless generations. The war between the British Crown and the rebellious colonists had torn the fabric of colonial life, and now it threatened to unravel the great peace that had bound the 6 nations together for centuries. In the council fires that burned through those dark months, voices rose and fell like the rhythm of ceremonial drums. The Mohawk, led by the formidable Joseph Branthenjanaja, in his own tongue argued for loyalty to the British Crown. They remembered the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which had promised to protect their lands from the endless hunger of colonial settlers. They remembered the treaties signed with kings across the Great Water, treaties that carried the weight of silver and the promise of protection. But the Oneida and Tuscarora heard different voices in the wind. They listened to the words of the Presbyterian missionary Samuel Kirkland, who spoke of liberty and self-determination. They saw in the American cause something that resonated with their own ancient principles of governance, the idea that power should flow from the people, not be imposed from above. The clan mothers deliberated long into the night, their words carrying the wisdom of generations, their decisions bearing the weight of futures yet unborn. The great council at Onondaga, where the sacred fire of the Confederacy had burned uninterrupted since the time of the Peacemaker, faced its greatest test. For the first time in living memory, the Six Nations could not speak with one voice. The tree of peace, which had sheltered so many beneath its branches, now cast shadows that divided rather than united. The eagle that nested in its crown looked down upon a people torn between competing loyalties, each claiming to serve the greater good. The decision, when it came, fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples that would spread far beyond the boundaries of Iroquois. The Confederacy Council, after days of deliberation, chose neutrality, a path that seemed wise in theory but proved impossible in practice. The war that raged around them demanded participation, and neutrality became, in the eyes of both sides, a form of betrayal. Joseph Brant, his face painted with the traditional marks of a war leader, made his choice clear. The Mohawk would fight alongside the British, honoring the treaties signed with the Crown and the promises made by royal officials. He gathered around him not only warriors from his own nation, but volunteers from the other nations who shared his vision of the struggle. They were joined by loyalist settlers, creating a formidable force that would strike terror into the frontier. Settlements of New York and Pennsylvania. The raids that followed were devastating in their effectiveness. Brant's forces, moving like shadows through forests they had known since childhood, struck at isolated settlements and fortified positions with equal skill. Cherry Valley, Wyoming Valley, Kobleskill, these names would be remembered with horror by American settlers. But to the Mohawk and their allies, they represented acts of war conducted according to the ancient protocols of forest warfare. Yet, even in war, the influence of Haudenosaunee tradition remained strong. When Brant's warriors took prisoners, they were often adopted into the tribe rather than killed. Following ancient customs that valued the preservation of life and the incorporation of useful knowledge, children captured in raids might grow up to become full members of Mohawk society, their birth origins eventually forgotten in the larger story of their adopted clan. Meanwhile, the Oneida and Tuscarora, led by chiefs like Shenandoah, chose the path of alliance with the Americans. They served as scouts and guides for continental forces, their knowledge of forest paths and seasonal patterns proving invaluable to American commanders struggling to understand the geography of their own continent. At the Battle of Saratoga, Oneida warriors fought alongside American troops, their presence contributing to the victory that would ultimately bring France into the war and seal the fate of British North America. The cost of this division ran deeper than military casualties. Families were torn apart as brothers chose different sides, and ancient kinship networks that had bound the Six Nations together for generations began to fray. The councils that had once gathered representatives from all nations now met in partial session, the empty seats serving as silent reminders of a unity that seemed to slip further away with each passing season. In the longhouses, the elderly keepers of tradition struggled to maintain the ceremonies that connected the people to their spiritual foundations. The green corn ceremony, the midwinter ceremony, the Thanksgiving address, these ancient practices continued even as the world around them changed beyond recognition. The clan mothers, those wise women who held the power to name and depose chiefs, found their authority tested as never before. How could they maintain the balance between the spiritual and political realms, when the political realm itself had become a battlefield? The summer of 1779 brought devastation on a scale that the Haudenosaunee had never experienced. General John Sullivan, following orders from George Washington himself, led an expedition into the heart of Iroquois territory with a simple mandate to destroy the Six Nations as a military force and remove their threat to the frontier settlements forever. The army that marched into the forests of central New York was the largest military force ever assembled on the American continent. Nearly 5,000 soldiers armed with artillery and supported by a massive supply train. Sullivan's campaign was methodical. In its destruction at Newtown, near present-day Elmira, his forces met and defeated a combined force of Loyalists and Iroquois warriors led by Joseph Brant. The battle itself was decisive enough, but its aftermath proved far more devastating. Sullivan's troops spread out across the countryside like a plague of locusts, burning everything in their path. The soldiers found towns that had stood for generations, their longhouses arranged in the traditional patterns that reflected the clan structure of Haudenosaunee society. These buildings, constructed from the living wood of the forest, had sheltered families through countless winters. Their destruction was not merely military, it was cultural annihilation. Each longhouse that went up in flames took with it not just shelter, but the accumulated wisdom of generations. The carefully maintained relationships between clans, the very physical foundation of Haudenosaunee society. More devastating still was the destruction of the food supplies that would have sustained the communities through the coming winter. Sullivan's men found vast fields of corn, beans, and squashed the three sisters that had sustained indigenous peoples for 1,000 years. They found orchards heavy with fruit, their trees groaning under the weight of apples, pears, and peaches that had been carefully cultivated by indigenous hands. All of it was destroyed, systematically and thoroughly, leaving nothing that could sustain human life. The refugees who fled before Sullivan's advance faced a choice between starvation and exile. Many made their way to Fort Niagara, where British officials struggled to provide for thousands of displaced people with supplies intended for a much smaller garrison. The winter of 1779 to 1780, remembered as the winter of the Great Hunger, claimed hundreds of lives as elderly people and children succumbed to cold and malnutrition in the crowded camps around the fort. Those who survived faced a reality that their ancestors had never contemplated, the possibility that the Haudenosaunee might cease to exist as a distinct people. The physical infrastructure of their societies, the towns, the fields, the carefully maintained relationships with the land had been obliterated in a single campaign. The social infrastructure, the councils, the ceremonies, the networks of kinship and obligation that had held the Confederacy together had been scattered to the winds along with the people themselves. Yet even in this darkest hour, the traditions that had sustained the Haudenosaunee for so many generations continued to provide strength. The elderly clan mothers, refugees though they were, maintained their authority and their responsibility to preserve the ancient knowledge. In the camps around Fort Niagara, in the temporary shelters thrown up in the forests of the Allegheny region, the ceremonies continued. The stories were still told, the languages still spoken, the complex protocols of government and diplomacy still observed. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 marked the official end of the American Revolution, but for the Haudenosaunee, it marked the beginning of a new and perhaps more devastating phase of their struggle for survival. The British negotiators, despite their promises of protection and alliance, abandoned their indigenous allies in the peace settlement. The new United States was granted sovereignty over all territory east of the Mississippi River, with no mention of indigenous rights or territories. Joseph Brant, reading the terms of the treaty in the cold light of political reality, understood that his people had been betrayed by those they had trusted. The British Crown, which had promised protection in exchange for military alliance, had sacrificed Haudenosaunee interests for the sake of a broader imperial settlement. The Mohawk and their allies found themselves people without a country, their ancient territories now legally the property of their former enemies. The British government, perhaps recognizing the magnitude of their betrayal, made efforts to provide for the displaced Haudenosaunee. In 1784, Governor Frederick Haldimand of Quebec purchased a large tract of land along the Grand River in what is now Ontario, offering it as a new home for those who had remained loyal to the Crown. The Haldimand Grant, as it came to be known, would become the foundation of the Six Nations Reserve, the largest First Nations reserve in Canada. The journey to the Grand River was more than a physical relocation. It was a spiritual and cultural migration that tested every assumption about what it meant to be Haudenosaunee. The refugees who made the journey carried with them the sacred objects of their people, the wampum belts that recorded the ancient laws, the clan symbols that maintained family relationships, the seeds of the three sisters that would allow them to recreate their agricultural life in a new land. Yet the land along the Grand River, fertile though it was, could never truly replace what had been lost. The ancient towns of the Mohawk Valley, with their carefully chosen locations and their generations of accumulated meaning, existed now only in memory. The burial grounds where ancestors slept, the sacred sites where important ceremonies had been conducted, the very geography that had shaped Haudenosaunee's spiritual life, all of this remained in the hands of their enemies. The process of rebuilding required not just physical reconstruction, but cultural adaptation. The traditional clan system, which had been based on specific territorial relationships, had to be reconceptualized for a new environment. The complex protocol of the Confederacy Council, which had assumed the presence of representatives from all six nations, had to be modified to accommodate the fact that the nations were now scattered across hundreds of miles and two different colonial jurisdictions. Some of the Haudenosaunee remained in their traditional territories, accepting American citizenship and attempting to maintain their communities within the boundaries of the new United States. The Seneca established several small reservations in western New York, while the Oneida and Tuscarora struggled to maintain their communities in the face of increasing pressure from white settlers. These communities faced the additional challenge of dealing with American officials who had no understanding of Haudenosaunee government and little respect for indigenous sovereignty. The division of the Six Nations between the United States and British North America created new challenges for maintaining traditional governance. The Grand Council, which had once met regularly at Onondaga, could no longer convene in its traditional form. Representatives from the different nations had to travel across international borders, subject to the passport requirements and political tensions of their respective colonial governments. The unity that had been the Confederacy's greatest strength began to fragment under the pressure of external political realities. In the depths of this cultural crisis, when many believed that the Haudenosaunee way of life was doomed to extinction, a voice arose from the most unlikely source. Handsome Lake, a Seneca chief who had fallen into despair and alcoholism as his world collapsed around him, experienced a series of visions that would reshape indigenous spiritual life and provide a path forward for his people. The visions came to Handsome Lake in the summer of 1799, as he lay dying in a cabin on the Allegheny Reservation in western New York. In these spiritual encounters, he was visited by 4 beings who identified themselves as messengers sent by the Creator to deliver a new teaching to his people. The message they brought was both revolutionary and deeply traditional, calling for a return to ancient values while acknowledging the realities of life in a world dominated by European American society. The Code of Handsome Lake, as his teachings came to be known, addressed the specific challenges facing Haudenosaunee communities in the early 19th century. It condemned the use of alcohol, which had devastated indigenous communities throughout North America. It called for a return to traditional family structures and the strengthening of clan relationships. It emphasized the importance of the ancient ceremonies while adapting them to contemporary circumstances. Perhaps most importantly, the Longhouse religion, as it came to be called, provided a framework for maintaining Haudenosaunee identity while participating in the broader North American economy. Handsome Lake taught that his people should adopt certain European technologies and practice steel tools, frame houses, formal education, while maintaining their spiritual and cultural distinctiveness. This synthesis allowed Haudenosaunee communities to survive and even thrive in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate completely into European American society. The spread of the Longhouse religion created a new form of Pan-Haudenosaunee identity that transcended the national boundaries that had divided the 6 nations. The same ceremonies were conducted in the longhouses of the Grand River Reserve and the reservations of western New York. The same stories were told, the same songs sung, the same Thanksgiving addresses offered to the Creator. This shared spiritual life helped maintain the cultural connections that political division had threatened to sever. The revival, led by Handsome Lake, also reinvigorated traditional forms of governance. The clan mothers, whose authority had been challenged by the chaos of the Revolutionary War period, found their positions strengthened by teachings that emphasized the importance of traditional gender roles and family structures. The chiefs, selected according to ancient protocols, gained new legitimacy as spiritual as well as political leaders. Yet the Longhouse religion was not simply a return to the past. It represented a creative adaptation of ancient wisdom to contemporary circumstances, a demonstration of the flexibility and resilience that had always characterized Haudenosaunee culture. The fact that this revival occurred during the darkest period in Haudenosaunee history testified to the enduring strength of the spiritual foundations upon which their society had been built. The early decades of the 19th century brought new pressures. As the young American Republic expanded westward and the demand for indigenous lands intensified, the Haudenosaunee communities that had remained in their traditional territories found themselves increasingly surrounded by European American settlements, their remaining lands coveted by speculators and farmers who saw indigenous ownership as an obstacle to progress. The Oneida, who had allied with the Americans during the Revolution, discovered that their loyalty provided little protection against the land hunger of their neighbors. Despite their military service and their adoption of many European customs, they faced constant pressure to sell their remaining lands and relocate to territories west of the Mississippi River. Some Oneida groups eventually accepted removal to Wisconsin, where they established new communities and attempted to maintain their traditional ways in a completely alien environment. The Seneca faced their own crisis when the Ogden Land Company, backed by powerful political interests, launched a campaign to acquire their reservations in western New York. The company used every tool at its disposal: bribery, intimidation, alcohol, and fraud to pressure Seneca leaders into signing treaties. that would have extinguished their land rights entirely. The resistance to these efforts was led by Red Jacket, an orator whose speeches defending Seneca's sovereignty became legendary throughout the region. Red Jacket's speeches, delivered in his own language and translated for white audiences, articulated a sophisticated defense of indigenous rights that drew on both traditional Haudenosaunee political theory and contemporary American legal principles. He argued that the Seneca, as a sovereign people, had the right to determine their own future. He pointed out the hypocrisy of American officials who spoke of liberty and self-determination while attempting to force indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. The legal battles that resulted from these conflicts helped establish important precedents in American Indian law. The Seneca employed some of the most skilled lawyers in the country, challenging the validity of fraudulent treaties. In federal courts, while they were not entirely successful in preventing the loss of some lands, they did establish the principle that indigenous nations had legal standing and that treaties required genuine consent rather than mere signatures obtained through coercion. Meanwhile, in British North America, the Haudenosaunee communities on the Grand River faced different but equally challenging pressures. The British government, influenced by the same assimilationist ideology that drove American policy, implemented programs designed to civilize indigenous peoples by forcing them to abandon their traditional ways of life. Children were sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their own languages or practice their own customs. Traditional governance structures were undermined by the imposition of elected band councils that answered to Canadian officials rather than to clan mothers and traditional chiefs. The response to these pressures varied from community to community. Some groups embraced aspects of European American culture while maintaining their spiritual and political distinctiveness. Others retreated more deeply into traditional practices, viewing any accommodation with white society as a betrayal of ancestral values. Still others attempted to find a middle path, adopting those European technologies and practices that seemed useful while rejecting those that threatened their cultural integrity. As the 19th century progressed, the Haudenosaunee faced a fundamental challenge to their very existence as distinct political entities. Both the American and Canadian governments were committed to the eventual assimilation of indigenous peoples, viewing separate indigenous nations as obstacles to national unity and progress. The legal and political battles that resulted from this conflict would establish important precedents that continue to influence indigenous rights today. The Haudenosaunee position was articulated most clearly in their dealings with the American government. They maintained that the Six Nations Confederacy was a sovereign entity that had never been conquered and had never voluntarily surrendered its independence. They pointed to the treaties signed with colonial governments and the early American Republic as evidence of their status as a separate nation, capable of conducting international relations. This position was challenged by American officials who argued that indigenous nations were domestic dependent nations subject to federal authority. The legal doctrine of wardship, developed by the Supreme Court in cases like Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, placed indigenous peoples in a legal limbo where they were neither fully sovereign nor full citizens. This doctrine provided the legal justification for federal policies that would have been unthinkable if applied to truly independent nations. The Haudenosaunee response to these challenges demonstrated both their sophisticated understanding of legal and political processes and their commitment to maintaining their traditional forms of governance. They sent delegations to Washington and Ottawa, presenting their case to government officials and the general public. They published newspapers and pamphlets explaining their position. They formed alliances with other indigenous nations facing similar challenges. Perhaps most importantly, they maintained their traditional council system even when it was not recognized. By surrounding governments, the Grand Council continued to meet, even if its decisions were ignored by American and Canadian officials. The clan mothers continued to select chiefs according to ancient protocols, even if those chiefs were not recognized by government bureaucrats. The ancient ceremonies continued to be performed, maintaining the spiritual foundations of Haudenosaunee society, even as its political foundations were under attack. The boarding school era represented one of the most systematic attacks on Haudenosaunee culture. Children as young as 5 or 6 were removed from their families and communities, often for years at a time, and placed in institutions designed to kill the Indian and save the man. These schools, operated by both government agencies and religious organizations, forbade the use of indigenous languages, the practice of traditional customs, and even contact with family members. Yet even this assault on the cultural foundations of Haudenosaunee society was not entirely successful. Some children learned to navigate between two worlds, maintaining their traditional identity while acquiring the skills necessary to function in European American society. Others returned to their communities as adults with a renewed appreciation for the values and traditions they had been forced to abandon. Still, others became leaders in the struggle for indigenous rights, using their education as a weapon against the system that had sought to destroy their identity. The early decades of the 20th century marked a turning point in Haudenosaunee history. After generations of decline and cultural assault, indigenous communities began to experience a renaissance that would ultimately restore much of their political and cultural vitality. This revival was led by a new generation of leaders who combined traditional knowledge with modern skills, creating a synthesis that allowed their communities to survive and thrive. In the contemporary world, the catalyst for this renaissance was often external pressure that forced Haudenosaunee communities to articulate and defend their traditional values. World War I brought the question of Haudenosaunee sovereignty into sharp focus when the American government attempted to draft indigenous men for military service. The Six Nations maintained that as citizens of sovereign nations, they could not be conscripted by the United States, though they were willing to volunteer for military service as allies. This position led to legal battles that clarified the relationship between indigenous nations and the American government. The Haudenosaunee argued successfully that their treaties with the United States were international agreements between sovereign powers, not domestic legislation that could be unilaterally modified. This legal victory provided the foundation for later assertions of sovereignty and self-determination. The cultural renaissance was equally important. The Longhouse religion experienced a revival as traditional ceremonies were re-established and ancient songs and stories were rescued from near extinction. The Haudenosaunee languages, which had been driven to the brink of extinction by decades of suppression, began to be taught again to young people eager to reconnect with their heritage. The 1920s and 1930s saw the emergence of a new generation of Haudenosaunee intellectuals who played important roles in the broader indigenous rights movement. These leaders, educated in both traditional and European American systems, were able to articulate Haudenosaunee positions in terms that white society could understand while maintaining the essential elements of traditional governance and spiritual life. The Great Depression brought unexpected opportunities for cultural revival. Federal programs designed to provide employment for unemployed Americans included provisions for documenting and preserving indigenous cultures. Haudenosaunee elders were hired to record traditional stories, songs, and ceremonies that might otherwise have been lost. These recordings, preserved in archives and later made available to contemporary communities, became crucial resources for cultural revitalization efforts. World War II presented the Haudenosaunee with another opportunity to demonstrate their sovereignty. The Six Nations independently declared war on Germany and Japan, asserting their right as sovereign nations to determine their own foreign policy. This symbolic act reinforced their claims to international recognition while demonstrating their commitment to the Allied cause. The post-war period brought new challenges and opportunities. The termination policies of the 1950s threatened to eliminate federal recognition of indigenous nations entirely, forcing Haudenosaunee communities to mobilize in their own defense. The civil rights movement of the 1960s provided a model for indigenous activism, while the broader cultural changes of that decade created new openness to alternative ways of understanding society and governance. The latter half of the 20th century witnessed a remarkable transformation in Haudenosaunee communities. The cultural revival that had begun earlier in the century gained momentum, while new forms of political activism emerged to challenge centuries of oppression and marginalization. The Haudenosaunee, who had once been written off as a vanishing people, not only survived but began to exert influence far beyond their own communities. The American Indian movement of the 1960s and 1970s included many Haudenosaunee activists who drew on their traditional political theories to articulate a vision of indigenous rights that resonated throughout Indian country. The occupation of Alcatraz, the trail of broken treaties, and the siege at Wounded Knee all included significant Haudenosaunee participation, bringing traditional concepts of sovereignty and self-determination into the mainstream of American political discourse. Perhaps more importantly, Haudenosaunee communities began to assert their sovereignty in practical terms. They established their own educational systems, from elementary schools that taught in indigenous languages to colleges that offered degrees in traditional knowledge. They developed their own court systems, based on traditional concepts of justice and reconciliation rather than European American models of punishment and retribution. The economic development that began in the 1970s and accelerated in subsequent decades transformed Haudenosaunee communities from some of the poorest in North America to some of the most prosperous. Gaming enterprises, initially controversial within traditional communities, provided the economic foundation for cultural revitalization and political independence. The revenues generated by these enterprises funded language programs, cultural centers, and traditional governance systems. The environmental movement of the late 20th century found natural allies among the Haudenosaunee, whose traditional ecological knowledge had been developed over thousands of years of sustainable living. Haudenosaunee leaders became prominent voices in debates over climate change, environmental protection, and sustainable development. Their traditional concepts of the 7 generations, the idea that all decisions should consider their impact 7 generations into the future, provided a framework for long-term thinking that contrasted sharply with the short-term focus of contemporary politics and economics. The revival of traditional governance systems represented perhaps the most significant development in modern Haudenosaunee history. Communities that had been governed by externally imposed systems for generations began to reassert the authority of traditional chiefs and clan mothers. The ancient protocols of the Grand Council were re-established, allowing the Six Nations to speak with one voice on issues of common concern. This revival was not simply a return to the past, but a creative adaptation of ancient principles to contemporary circumstances. Traditional governance systems were modified to address modern challenges while maintaining their essential character. Women's roles, which had been marginalized by centuries of patriarchal influence, were reasserted as central to Haudenosaunee. Political life, the clan system, which had been disrupted by forced relocations and cultural suppression, was reconstructed to provide the foundation for contemporary community organization. The international recognition of indigenous rights that began in the 1980s provided new opportunities for Haudenosaunee diplomacy. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted in 2007, recognized many of the principles that the Haudenosaunee had been advocating for centuries. The right to self-determination, the protection of traditional territories, and the preservation of indigenous cultures all received international endorsement. The advent of the digital age presented both unprecedented opportunities and unique challenges for Haudenosaunee communities. The same technologies that threatened to homogenize global culture also provided new tools for preserving and transmitting traditional knowledge. The Internet, once viewed with suspicion by traditional communities, became a powerful medium for cultural revitalization and political organizing. Language preservation efforts were revolutionized by digital technologies. Traditional speakers, many of them elderly, were able to record vast amounts of linguistic material that could be preserved indefinitely and made available to learners around the world. Interactive language learning programs, based on traditional pedagogical methods but enhanced by multimedia technology, made it possible for young people to learn their ancestral languages even when they lived far from traditional communities. The documentation of traditional knowledge also benefited from digital technology. Ceremonies that had been transmitted orally for generations could now be recorded and preserved, though always with careful attention to the protocols that govern the sharing of sacred knowledge. Traditional ecological knowledge accumulated over millennia of careful observation could be integrated with contemporary scientific understanding to address modern environmental challenges. Social media platforms, despite their origins in mainstream American culture, became important tools for maintaining connections within dispersed Haudenosaunee communities. Family members separated by hundreds of miles could maintain daily contact. Traditional knowledge holders could share their expertise with learners across the continent. Political activists could coordinate their efforts and share information about threats to indigenous rights. The gaming industry, which had provided economic independence for many Haudenosaunee communities, was transformed by digital technology. Online gaming platforms allowed even remote communities to participate in the global economy while maintaining their traditional territories. The revenues generated by these enterprises continued to fund cultural programs, educational initiatives, and political activism. Yet the digital age also brought new threats to traditional ways of life. Young people, immersed in global digital culture, sometimes found it difficult to connect with traditional values and practices. The pace of technological change often outstripped communities' ability to adapt while maintaining their cultural integrity. The commodification of traditional knowledge, as non-indigenous people appropriated indigenous symbols and practices for commercial purposes, created new forms of cultural exploitation. The response to these challenges demonstrated the continuing vitality of traditional Haudenosaunee governance systems. The clan mothers and traditional chiefs, drawing on centuries of experience in adapting to changing circumstances, developed protocols for engaging with digital technology that preserved essential cultural values while embracing useful innovations. Traditional ceremonies were adapted to include prayers for guidance in navigating the digital world. Educational programs were developed to help young people understand how traditional values could be maintained in contemporary circumstances. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020-2021 provided an unexpected test of these adaptations. When traditional gatherings became impossible due to health restrictions, Haudenosaunee communities successfully moved many of their activities online. Council meetings, educational programs, and even certain ceremonies were conducted through digital platforms, maintaining community connections during a period of enforced isolation. As the 21st century progressed, a new generation of Haudenosaunee leaders emerged who embodied the synthesis of traditional knowledge and contemporary skills that had become characteristic of their communities. These young people, educated in both indigenous and mainstream institutions, comfortable with both ancient protocols and modern technology, represented the fulfillment of prophecies that had sustained their people through centuries of struggle. The prophecy of the seventh generation, long a source of hope during the darkest periods of Haudenosaunee history, spoke of a time when the seventh generation of children would be born with the knowledge and skills necessary to restore their people's place in the world, as the descendants of those who had survived the Revolutionary War, the removals, the boarding schools, and all the other assaults on their culture. Contemporary Haudenosaunee youth seemed to embody this prophetic vision. These young leaders approached traditional governance with both reverence and innovation. They understood that the ancient principles of the Great Law had to be applied to circumstances that the Peacemaker could never have imagined, but they also recognized that these principles contained wisdom that was as relevant in the digital age as it had been in the age of stone tools and bark canoes. Their challenge was to maintain the essential character of Haudenosaunee governance while adapting it to address contemporary issues like climate change, globalization, and technological disruption. The environmental movement continued to provide a natural arena for Haudenosaunee leadership. Traditional ecological knowledge, refined over thousands of years of sustainable living, offered alternatives to the destructive practices that had brought the planet to the brink of ecological collapse. The concept of the 7 generations, which required consideration of the long-term consequences of all decisions, provided a framework for addressing challenges like climate change that required thinking beyond the electoral cycles and quarterly reports that dominated contemporary politics. Young Haudenosaunee activists played prominent roles in movements like the struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline and the campaign to address climate change. Their presence at these events was not merely symbolic. They brought with them sophisticated understanding of both traditional governance and contemporary political processes, along with networks of support that extended throughout indigenous communities across North America. The revival of traditional arts and crafts provided another avenue for cultural expression and economic development. Young artists, trained in both traditional techniques and contemporary media, created works that bridged the gap between ancient traditions and modern sensibilities. Their art appeared in galleries and museums around the world, bringing Haudenosaunee perspectives to audiences who might never have encountered indigenous culture otherwise. Perhaps most importantly, this new generation approached the question of cultural continuity with confidence rather than anxiety. Unlike their parents and grandparents, who had lived with the constant fear that their culture might disappear entirely, Young Haudenosaunee people took their cultural survival for granted and focused instead on how to strengthen and expand their traditions. They saw themselves not as the last representatives of a vanishing culture, but as the inheritors of a living tradition that would continue to evolve and adapt for generations to come. The influence of Haudenosaunee political thought on the development of democratic governance extends far beyond the borders of their own communities. The principles embodied in the great law of peace, the separation of powers, the system of checks and balances, the concept of representative government accountable to the people can be traced through the writings of European philosophers and the constitutional conventions of emerging democratic nations. The founding fathers of the American Republic, particularly Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, acknowledged their debt to indigenous political thought. Franklin's Albany Plan of Union, which proposed a federal system for the American colonies, was explicitly based on the Haudenosaunee model. Jefferson's notes on indigenous governance, preserved in his personal papers, reveal a deep appreciation for the democratic principles that the Haudenosaunee had been practicing for centuries. Before Europeans arrived in North America, the influence extended beyond political structures to encompass broader questions of human rights and social organization. The role of women in Haudenosaunee society, particularly the authority of clan mothers to select and depose chiefs, provided a model for gender equality that was far in advance of European practices. The emphasis on consensus building and the inclusion of all voices in decision-making processes offered alternatives to the majoritarian democracy that often marginalized minority perspectives. The concept of the 7 generations, which required consideration of the long-term consequences of all decisions, influenced the development of environmental ethics and sustainable development practices around the world. This principle, embedded in traditional Haudenosaunee governance, provided a framework for addressing challenges that required thinking beyond the short-term focus of contemporary politics and economics. Contemporary international law increasingly reflects principles that the Haudenosaunee have been advocating for centuries. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognizes the right to self-determination, the protection of traditional territories, and the preservation of indigenous cultural concepts that were central to Haudenosaunee political thought long before they gained international recognition. The restorative justice movement, which emphasizes healing and reconciliation rather than punishment and retribution, draws heavily on indigenous legal traditions, including those of the Haudenosaunee. Traditional concepts of justice, which focused on restoring balance and harmony to communities disrupted by conflict, offered alternatives to the adversarial legal systems that dominated European American society. The influence of Haudenosaunee thought on contemporary environmentalism extends beyond specific policies to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between human beings and the natural world. The traditional understanding of humans as part of the web of life, rather than separate from or superior to other species, provided a philosophical foundation for ecological thinking that challenged the anthropocentric assumptions of Western civilization. Perhaps most importantly, the Haudenosaunee example demonstrated that alternative forms of social organization were not only possible but could be remarkably successful and enduring. The fact that their system of governance had survived for centuries, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character, provided hope for those seeking alternatives to the social and political systems that had brought humanity to the brink of ecological and social collapse. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the mist rises from the rivers and the ancient forests seem to breathe with the memory of countless generations. The spirit of the Haudenosaunee lives on. The Longhouses may be fewer now, scattered across a continent that has been transformed beyond recognition, but the values they sheltered, the commitment to peace, the respect for the natural world, the understanding that governance must serve the people rather than rule over them, continue to shape the world in ways both seen and unseen. The great tree of peace, which the Peacemaker planted in the imagination of his people over 1,000 years ago, has grown beyond the boundaries of any single nation or territory. Its roots extend deep into the soil of human consciousness, drawing nourishment from the same sources that sustained the Haudenosaunee through centuries of trial and transformation. Its branches shelter peoples who may never have heard of the Six Nations, but who share their commitment to justice, equality, and the sacred responsibility of each generation to preserve the world for those yet to come. The eagle that nests in the crown of this tree looks out over a world that would be unrecognizable to the chiefs who first gathered at Onondaga to smoke the pipe of peace. Yet the challenges facing humanity in the 21st century, the need for sustainable relationships with the natural world, the struggle to create just and equitable societies, the imperative to think beyond immediate self-interest, to consider the welfare of future generations, are precisely the challenges that the great law of peace was designed to address. The clan mothers, those wise women who held the power to select and guide the leaders of their people, continue their work in forms that might surprise their ancestors, but would not, perhaps, astonish them. The principles they embody, the understanding that true leadership serves rather than commands, that wisdom comes from listening to all voices, that the welfare of children must be the ultimate measure of political success, find expression in contemporary movements for social justice, environmental protection, and democratic reform around the world. The ceremonies continue, adapted to contemporary circumstances, but maintaining their essential purpose of connecting human beings to the natural world and to each other. The Thanksgiving addresses that begin every traditional gathering, acknowledging the gifts of the earth and sky and all the beings that share this world, offer a model for the kind of gratitude and humility that might yet save humanity from the consequences of its own short-sightedness. The languages, those repositories of ancient wisdom and unique ways of understanding the world, survive in the voices of children who learn them in immersion schools, in the recordings of elders preserved in digital archives, in the songs that echo through longhouses, where the cycle of ceremonies continues to mark the passage of seasons and generations. Each word spoken in Mohawk or Seneca or Cayuga carries within it not just meaning but memory, not just information but identity, not just communication but communion with all those who spoke these languages before and all those who will speak them in the years to come. The traditional knowledge, accumulated over millennia of careful observation and respectful interaction with the natural world, finds new relevance as humanity grapples with the consequences of industrial civilization. The understanding of forest ecology, the knowledge of plant medicines, the awareness of seasonal cycles and natural rhythms, all of this continues to offer alternatives to the mechanistic worldview that has brought the planet to the brink of ecological collapse. The political traditions, those sophisticated systems of governance that managed to maintain peace among diverse peoples for centuries, continue to influence the development of democratic institutions around the world. The principles of federalism, the separation of powers, the accountability of leaders to the people, all of these concepts, refined through generations of Haudenosaunee political practice, have become fundamental elements of modern democratic theory. Yet perhaps The most important legacy of the Haudenosaunee is not any specific institution or practice, but the larger vision they embodied, the understanding that human beings can live in harmony with each other and with the natural world, that governance can serve the common good rather than private interest, that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the active cultivation of relationships based on mutual respect and shared responsibility. This vision, born in the forests of northeastern North America, but nurtured by the dreams and struggles of countless generations, now belongs to all humanity. It whispers in the wind that moves through urban parks and surviving wilderness areas alike. It speaks in the voices of activists who challenge injustice and inequality. It shines in the eyes of children who learn to see themselves as part of the web of life rather than separate from it. The forest kingdom of the Haudenosaunee, in its physical form, may have been reduced to scattered reserves and reservations, but its spiritual essence has escaped all boundaries. It lives wherever people gather to seek peace rather than dominance, wherever they choose cooperation over competition, wherever they remember that the earth is not a commodity to be exploited, but a sacred trust to be preserved for those who will come after. In the councils of the United Nations, where the voices of indigenous peoples are finally being heard, the principles of the great law of peace find new expression. In the classrooms where children learn to think like scientists and poets, like citizens and stewards, the educational vision of the Haudenosaunee continues to bear fruit. In the laboratories where researchers work to heal the damage done to the natural world, the traditional ecological knowledge of the forest peoples offers guidance for restoration and renewal. The wampum belts, those ancient records of treaties and alliances, continue to speak to those who know how to read them. They remind us that relationships, once established in good faith, create obligations that transcend the lifespans of the individuals who make them. They teach us that words have power, that promises have consequences, that the agreements we make today will bind our children and our children's children as night falls over the continent that was once entirely indigenous, and the lights of cities twinkle like earthbound stars across the landscape. The ancient songs continue. They rise from the longhouses where the faithful gather, from the cultural centers where the young learn the wisdom of their elders, from the hearts of individuals who carry the traditions forward even when they walk alone through the modern world. And so the story continues, not as history but as prophecy, not as memory but as promise. The tree of peace grows still, its roots deepening with each passing year, its branches reaching toward a sky that knows no boundaries. The eagle watches from its nest in the crown, scanning the horizon for signs of the world that is yet to come. The world where the wisdom of the forest people guides the councils of all nations, where the Thanksgiving addresses echo in every language, where the 7 generations yet unborn look back with gratitude upon those who chose to plant seeds of peace in the fertile soil of human consciousness. In the rustling of leaves that remember the footsteps of the Peacemaker, in the flow of rivers that carried the canoes of countless generations, in the cycle of seasons that marks the eternal renewal of life itself. The forest kingdom of the Haudenosaunee lives on not as a relic of the past, but as a vision of the future. Not as something that was, but as something that yet might be. The fire burns on, tended by hands that bridge the centuries, fed by dreams that refuse to die, casting shadows that dance with the memory of all who came before and the hope of all who were yet to come. In that fire, the story never ends, only transforms, like the people themselves, adapting to new circumstances while keeping alive the eternal flame of wisdom, justice, and peace. Thank you for this journey, if this exploration of the forest kingdom of the Haudenosaunee has moved you, touched your heart, or opened your mind to new perspectives, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who might find meaning in these ancient stories, and subscribe to our channel. For more journeys through the landscapes of human history, the wisdom of the Haudenosaunee belongs not to any single people, but to all humanity. By sharing these stories, we honor their legacy and help ensure that their vision of peace, justice, and harmony continues to inspire future generations. Sweet dreams, and may the great tree of peace shelter your rest.